Hello everyone. Tonight, we turn our attention to a life lived at the very edges of land and sea, the quiet, repetitive, and strangely haunting world of 19th century American lighthouse keepers. These were men, and sometimes their families, stationed in lonely towers where the wind never ceased, the sea never rested, and the work never ended. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights, find a comfortable place to rest, and let the steady rhythm of this history carry you. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. It helps the channel reach more listeners, and it means you won't miss the next quiet journey into the past. Tonight, we begin at the shoreline itself, with the long and patient arrival at the coastline, the place where the keeper's duty began, and where solitude became a way of life. The coastlines of the United States in the 19th century stretched outward in a silence broken only by the rhythmic, unceasing sound of water. It was not the silence of stillness, but of repetition, the constant cycle of waves pressing themselves onto sand, retreating and returning again, long after those who lived nearby had ceased noticing their sound. To anyone approaching such a coast, whether by cart from the inland villages, or by the deck of a slow-moving coastal schooner, the first impression was not of the buildings set upon it, but of the sheer persistence of nature itself. These coasts were varied, yet they shared a quality of remoteness. The rocky inlets of Maine, jagged and sea-worn, greeted travelers with granite cliffs that seemed less like geographical features than like ancient fortresses built without hands. Far to the south, the barrier islands of North Carolina appeared as shifting strips of sand, unstable and constantly remade by storms, their dunes sparse with grass bent by prevailing winds. Along the Gulf of Mexico, the air hung heavier, carrying with it the brine of salt marshes and the scent of slow-moving tides. The Pacific coast, by contrast, presented dramatic cliffs, the Pacific surf pounding ceaselessly against them, while fog rolled in and retreated with equal regularity, making the land appear and disappear, as if it were a world half imagined. It was upon such margins that lighthouses stood, figures of stone, brick or iron, that looked less like places of human habitation, and more like austere sentinels. They were not scattered evenly, but placed at points where geography demanded intervention, promontories, where currents shifted suddenly, river mouths where sandbars formed treacherous shoals, and narrow straits where vessels might drift too close to hidden rocks. To those who first glimpsed a lighthouse, the structure often seemed suspended between two domains, too solitary to feel part of the land, yet too solid to belong to the shifting, restless sea. For the 19th century keeper arriving at his post, the approach was rarely one of ease. Some lighthouses could be reached only by small rowboats, timed carefully with the tides. Others required long journeys across sand or marsh, where there were no true roads, only faint tracks marked by earlier supply wagons. In winter, approaches grew treacherous, the winds so cold that the spray of seawater froze before reaching the ground, forming strange ice-sheathed patterns on the wooden fences and grass. And yet the keepers arrived, sometimes accompanied by their families, sometimes alone, bearing only the belongings they could carry, and the instructions issued by the U.S. Lighthouse Board, or its earlier administrative forms. The landscape itself offered little welcome. Settlers who farmed a few miles inland might exchange words with keepers when they traveled to town, but in general, the outposts were considered apart. The coast, while beautiful to travelers passing briefly through, was to the permanent resident a place of monotony. Its winds wore down the edges of paint, its salt corroded metal, its moisture-softened timber, and its isolation tested human patience. To live there was to accept that one's daily companions would be tides, gulls and storms rather than neighbors, shops or gatherings. Still, there was a certain solemnity to these landscapes that impressed itself on new arrivals. The horizon seemed broader at the coast than inland, stretching out across a sea that was both limitless and indifferent. The sky, unbroken by city smoke or tall buildings, moved with clouds of slow procession, so that even when no ships appeared, the world seemed busy with its own endless motions. The lighthouse itself, rising from this setting, offered a single vertical line against the horizontal vastness of sea and sky. For the keeper, it was both workplace and dwelling, both sanctuary and prison, a structure that marked the transition from ordinary life to the regulated solitude that awaited him. To approach such a place was to feel the weight of continuity. For lighthouses were not built for comfort or fashion, but for endurance. Their foundations were sunk deep into bedrock, their stones cut to resist erosion, their lanterns raised high, not for ornament, but for visibility. The keeper, stepping across the threshold, entered not a home in the familiar sense, but a mechanism, a living instrument whose every stair and corridor existed in service to a single purpose, to emit a guiding light into the surrounding dark. And yet, despite the official function, the arrival had a domestic side. The keeper carried with him small things meant to impose humanity on an otherwise impersonal setting, trunks filled with clothing, perhaps a Bible, perhaps a few novels or practical handbooks, simple cookware tools or cherished personal items. If a family accompanied him, the sound of children's voices sometimes echoed briefly against stone walls, their curiosity about the tower mingling with unease at its austerity. Wives often bore the greater burden, transforming stark quarters into something resembling a household, arranging sparse furnishings, hanging laundry in salt-heavy air, and adapting to the relentless shortage of company. What lay before each arrival was not a temporary station, but an open-ended residence. Some keepers served for only a handful of years before seeking other livelihoods. Others remained decades, their names recorded in logbooks and inspection reports, becoming as fixed to the lighthouse as the mortar that held its stones. The first days, however, were always a period of adjustment, the recognition that trips inland would be rare, that supply visits would be infrequent, and that storms would make even those uncertain. One might look inland, toward villages where life seemed busier, but the horizon outward, across water, held a different lesson, a reminder that their duty was less to the land behind them, and more to the countless vessels beyond, unseen yet dependent on the tower's future light. So began the life of the lighthouse keeper, with arrival at the coastline, a crossing from the world of community into the realm of solitude, from shifting human concerns to the unchanging rhythm of sea and sky. The coast was not a backdrop, but a presence, one that would shape every routine, every task, and every memory of those who kept its lights burning. The lonely arrival at the coastline, with its silent towers and unbroken horizons, was not an accident of scattered construction, nor the result of keepers choosing their solitude freely. Behind every lighthouse stood an institution, a bureaucracy that began quietly in the 18th century and unfolded gradually across the 19th. To understand the daily life of the keepers, one must step back into the structures of government that gave rise to their duties, because in the United States of the 19th century, even solitude was carefully organized. The first lighthouses in America predated the Republic itself. In 1716, the colonial government of Massachusetts oversaw the construction of Boston Light, the first lighthouse in what would later become the United States. Its purpose was practical, not symbolic. The approaches to Boston Harbor were crowded with shoals and islands, and the ships that carried goods and people from across the Atlantic required a steady beacon to navigate safely. Other colonies followed, placing simple lights at dangerous inlets, funding their maintenance through local duties on shipping. These early structures were modest, often little more than towers with oil lamps, and their care fell to appointed individuals who answered not to a national service but to local authorities. The Revolution shifted the matter into federal hands. When the Constitution was ratified, the new government assumed responsibility for all lighthouses, beacons, buoys, and public piers, recognizing that navigation was both a commercial lifeline and a matter of national safety. In 1789, Congress placed lighthouses under the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department, reflecting the early republic's tendency to see commerce and infrastructure as inseparable. From this moment, the light along the coast was no longer a matter of local initiative, but of centralized oversight, and with it came the slow birth of the system that would define the lives of 19th-century keepers. At first, administration was rudimentary. The Treasury contracted supplies of oil, paid keepers, and authorized repairs, but there was little in the way of standardization. Each keeper tended his light according to local tradition or personal judgment, and reports of uneven quality were common. In some places, lights were poorly maintained, their lenses clouded with soot, their towers untidy. In others, the keepers were diligent, but lacked resources, relying on inferior oil that burned with smoke, or on wicks that consumed fuel too quickly. Mariners complained, insurers worried, and officials in Washington began to see the need for reform. The 19th century brought that reform slowly but steadily. In 1820, the introduction of the Fresnel lens in Europe promised to revolutionize lighthouse technology, projecting beams more powerful and efficient than any before. It took decades for the US to adopt them broadly, hindered by cost and bureaucratic inertia, but their eventual implementation transformed the very nature of light keeping. By the mid-century, the federal government recognized that the service required not only equipment, but also discipline, and so inspections grew more regular, regulations more precise, and the keeper's role more standardized. By 1852, the system reached a turning point. That year, Congress established the Lighthouse Board, a body of naval officers, engineers, and scientific men who replaced the earlier looser arrangements of the Treasury. Their mandate was clear: to bring order, efficiency, and professionalism to a service that had been criticized for waste and inconsistency. They surveyed coasts systematically, identified sites for new lights, oversaw the installation of Fresnel lenses, and issued detailed manuals outlining the duties of keepers. With the board's authority, the lighthouse system became not merely a set of scattered towers, but a national network. For the keepers themselves, this shift meant that their lives, once defined by informal expectations, were increasingly bound to regulation. Their quarters were subject to inspection. Their records had to be written in precise forms, noting the consumption of oil, the hours of lighting, the condition of equipment, and the weather observed. Their very conduct was measured, for inspectors noted not only the state of the lighthouse, but the demeanor of the keeper, judging whether he was sober, orderly, and industrious. The bureaucracy reached into the most isolated of outposts, ensuring that no matter how far a keeper lived from the centers of government, he was still bound to its rules. And yet, the service remained modest in scope, compared to great military or political institutions. Its purpose was humble: to prevent wrecks, to safeguard commerce, to ensure that ships carrying grain, timber, or passengers reached their harbors intact. Few citizens thought much about it, and those who did often complained of its expenses. For the keepers, however, the Lighthouse Board and its bureaucratic structure were inescapable realities. The board determined the quantity of oil they would receive, the frequency of supply visits, the materials with which repairs could be made, and even the uniforms or insignia they wore when inspections demanded formality. The Treasury's hand remained visible in the financial side of the service. Salaries were modest, reflecting the government's reluctance to treat lighthouse keeping as a profession, equal to naval or civil service posts. Pay varied by the importance and isolation of the station. Larger coastal lights with heavier responsibilities earned their keepers more, while minor harbor lights paid less. Families often supplemented the meager income with gardens, fishing, or small livestock, though even these pursuits were shaped by the remoteness of the station and the demands of the light. What emerged from these arrangements was a paradoxical life, intensely local in its daily routines, yet inseparably tied to national oversight. The keeper might spend his day polishing brass or trimming wicks in utter solitude, yet the log he filled would travel eventually to Washington, becoming part of a report read by officers and bureaucrats hundreds of miles away. His home was perched at the edge of the sea, but his labor was woven into the commerce of an entire country, connecting him invisibly to merchants in New York, farmers in Ohio, and sailors in distant oceans, who would never know his name, but relied on the steadiness of his work. By the latter half of the 19th century, the Lighthouse Board had expanded the service into a robust institution. The number of lights along the coast grew steadily, supplemented by buoys, lightships, and fog signals. Technology improved, inspections became more rigorous, and the figure of the keeper, once a loosely defined caretaker, became a disciplined official, his duties outlined in exacting detail. To outsiders, he might still appear a lonely figure at the edge of the sea, but to the institution that governed him. He was part of a vast machine, one cog in a system whose success depended on order and uniformity. The establishment of the lighthouse service thus shaped not only the physical presence of towers along the coast, but the inner lives of those who tended them. Their solitude was structured, their freedom limited, their duty constant. The lighthouse was not theirs in any personal sense, it belonged to the nation, and they in turn belonged to the service. It was this bureaucratic foundation, steady, impersonal, often invisible, that gave the keeper's daily routine its character. Without it, the light might have burned intermittently, its care uneven, its meaning uncertain. With it, the lights became as regular as the tides, and the keepers' lives took on the same patient inevitability. For all the rules, instructions and bureaucratic procedures that governed the lighthouse service, there remained a deeply human moment that no regulation could capture: the first arrival at one's assigned post. After the paperwork had been completed, the salary negotiated, and the oil rations promised, the keeper, often accompanied by family or perhaps a solitary assistant, had to face the stark material reality of the station itself. This was no abstract position within a government structure, it was a posting at the very margin of land and water, an appointment to a place that was equal parts workplace, dwelling, and exile. The journey to the lighthouse rarely unfolded with ease. Supplies and personal belongings were carried by wagon where roads existed, though many ended abruptly in rough tracks leading only to fishing villages. From there, goods were often loaded into small boats, pulled across shallow water, or through channels that shifted unpredictably with the tides. Larger stations, such as those on prominent capes, might allow wagon access, but even these routes were subject to erosion, washouts, and seasonal flooding. Winter, with its ice and storms, turned such approaches into hazards. Summer, with its heat and glare, made them exhausting treks. The journey itself set the tone, reminding new keepers that their station was not meant for convenience. The first sight of the lighthouse could produce a mix of awe and apprehension. Rising against the sea and sky, its tower appeared both monumental and indifferent. Some lighthouses were squat, broad structures of stone. Others rose in narrow spirals, their lanterns visible long before the rest of the building emerged. The keeper's house might be attached or set nearby, often of plain construction, whitewashed or painted in muted tones. To the eye of the newcomer, these buildings carried no ornament, no comfort beyond necessity. Their purpose was functional, their style unyielding. The message was clear: this was not a place of leisure, but of duty. Stepping inside confirmed the impression. The interior of the keeper's dwelling offered little in the way of luxury. Rooms were small, their walls plain, their windows narrow against the wind. Furniture was minimal, often government-issued, and the air carried a faint tang of oil, for the storage of fuel was a constant necessity. In the tower, the spiral staircase rose in tight turns, its iron steps echoing with every footfall, leading up to the lantern room where the great lens waited, clean and cold in daylight. For many keepers, that climb became the most familiar journey of their lives, repeated daily, weekly, yearly, until its rhythm merged with the very passage of time. Isolation was immediate. Unlike other postings in government service, there was rarely a town to provide company, nor a steady stream of visitors. The keeper's world contracted quickly to a few square acres of land, a tower, and the surrounding sea. Families felt this acutely. Children, accustomed to the bustle of inland life, found themselves surrounded by nothing but waves, gulls, and the occasional supply boat. Wives, often charged with both household and assistance in the light's operation, faced the same unbroken horizon day after day. For those arriving alone, the solitude pressed even more heavily, broken only by the demands of duty and the routine of maintenance. The supply routes reinforced this sense of separation. Deliveries of oil, wicks, tools, and food came at intervals, sometimes monthly, sometimes less, depending on location and weather. A delay of even a week could alter the household's rhythm, forcing rationing of both provisions and effort. The keepers learned quickly that self-sufficiency was not a choice but a necessity. Gardens were planted where soil permitted, chickens or goats were kept if space allowed, and fishing became not just pastime but survival. Yet all of these, while familiar to rural life, were shaped by the peculiar constraint of the lighthouse setting. A garden planted too close to the sea might be destroyed by salt spray. Animals required care in conditions where storms could scatter them. Fishing depended on seas that might be too rough to approach for days. The first evenings brought a realization deeper than any inspection or manual could convey. As the sun lowered, the keeper faced the essential task for which he had been appointed: the lighting of the lamp, climbing the spiral stairs, trimming the wick, filling the reservoir, and igniting the flame were motions that at first felt ceremonial, charged with the significance of beginning a career. Yet, once the light began its steady burn, casting rays outward into the dusk, the keeper could not ignore the loneliness of the task. The light was visible to sailors miles away, but to the keeper, its presence was confined to a small room of glass and brass, accompanied only by the sound of the wind against the lantern panes. Down below, the dwelling settled into a quiet unlike that of inland homes. The soundscape was dominated, not by voices or passing wagons, but by waves against rock, the cry of seabirds, and the occasional groan of timbers strained by salt and damp. If the keeper's family was present, the household noises, cooking, cleaning, arranging belongings, provided a buffer, though one that could not conceal the broader emptiness. If alone, the silence became a companion, one that had to be endured, negotiated, and eventually accepted. For the many keepers, the first night was restless. The duties required checking the lamp at intervals, ensuring that the wick burned steadily, that the lens remained free of soot, and that no sudden gust or mechanical fault threatened the light. The logbook required entries, written by hand in dim rooms, recording times and conditions with a precision demanded by the lighthouse board. Sleep came in short intervals, broken by duty, and always with the awareness that neglect was unthinkable. Ships unseen beyond the horizon depended on the light, and any lapse carried consequences beyond the keeper's solitude. By morning, the strangeness of the new posting deepened. The lamp, extinguished with the day's first light, left behind the residue of burnt oil, which had to be cleaned without delay. Brass fittings demanded polishing, lenses required wiping, and floors needed sweeping. The keeper quickly discovered that the work was endless, repetitive, and yet entirely essential. Unlike other forms of labor, where progress might be measured in crops harvested or buildings raised, the keeper's effort left no visible trace. Its success was marked only by the absence of disaster. Thus, the first impressions of a keeper's post were less about novelty, and more about the recognition of permanence. What seemed at first daunting, the isolation, the rugged supply routes, the endless tasks, soon revealed itself as routine, a rhythm that would define not just weeks or months but years. The keeper learned that his life had narrowed to a fixed set of duties in a fixed place, his horizons marked not by ambition, but by the steady sweep of a lamp across the sea. The adjustment was not immediate, and for some it never came at all. But for those who endured, the first quiet evening spent adjusting to solitude became the foundation of a life at once monotonous and quietly monumental. To live within a lighthouse was to inhabit a structure unlike any other, one shaped not by aesthetic preference but by function, endurance, and the ceaseless demands of the sea. The architecture of these stations in the 19th century varied in detail: brick, stone or cast iron, tall, tapering towers, or shorter, stouter forms, yet they shared a singular character. They were designed for permanence, for the steady support of light, and for the protection of those who lived within. A walk through one reveals not a home in the conventional sense, but an arrangement of spaces whose purpose was bound entirely to duty. From the exterior, the tower often stood as the most visible feature. Rising against the horizon, its silhouette was plain, cylindrical or conical, tapering upward to the lantern room. Builders favored stone along rocky coasts where quarries were near, brick where transport allowed, and cast iron where prefabrication and shipping by sea could bring materials to remote sites. The walls were thick, sometimes several feet, not only to withstand storms, but to resist the gradual erosion of salt and wind. Painted white, or in broad stripes, the towers were less concerned with elegance than with visibility, both to the mariner at sea and the inspector approaching by land. At the base, one often entered through a door set low to the ground, the threshold raised to protect against flooding. Inside, the tower's interior was dim, the air carrying a faint coolness, for the thick masonry held the chill, even in summer. The floor might be stone slabs or brick, worn smooth by boots, and the first impression was of enclosure, the outside world muffled, the sound of waves and wind replaced by the echo of one's own movement. A spiral staircase rose upward, sometimes of cast iron, sometimes of stone, its narrow treads curving tightly around a central column. To ascend was to feel the confinement of the tower, the constant turning, the steady upward pull, the glimpse of higher landings through narrow shafts of light. Halfway up, there might be storage rooms, small arched chambers where cans of whale oil and later kerosene were kept. The oil rooms were among the most carefully maintained spaces, for fuel was both precious and hazardous. Containers were lined in neat rows, inspected for leaks, their lids secured. Regulations demanded exact accounting of oil used and stored, and so these rooms represented the bureaucratic presence within stone walls. Their smell was distinctive, sharp and penetrating, permeating clothing and furnishings alike, so that keepers carried with them the scent of their duty wherever they went. Ascending further, the staircase narrowed, the air growing lighter as windows admitted small shafts of daylight. These windows were set deep in the masonry, narrow to resist wind yet positioned to illuminate the stair without admitting excess weather. Their view was fragmentary, a sudden slice of sea or sky framed by stone, a reminder of the world outside that the keeper glimpsed only in passing. At the top, the stairs ended beneath a heavy iron door, often low and awkward, designed to separate the lantern room from the rest of the tower. Passing through it was like stepping into another realm, the functional core of the structure. The lantern room was the crown of the lighthouse, a glass enclosure where the great lens sat upon its pedestal. In daylight, the space was austere, panes of glass arranged in a circle, frames of iron to hold them against storms, the floor narrow and close about the mechanism. The Fresnel lens, once introduced, dominated the room, a glittering array of prisms and rings, cold and brilliant in the sun, engineered to bend light into a concentrated beam. The room smelled faintly of oil and metal polish, its surfaces spotless, for regulations demanded cleanliness to prevent soot or dust from diminishing the light. To stand here was to stand at the meeting point of land, sea and sky, the entire horizon visible in slow panorama as one moved around the circular chamber. Above, the roof was often a dome of copper or iron weathered green by salt air. A small vent at the top allowed smoke and heat to escape, for the lamp produced warmth that needed to be managed carefully. Around the exterior ran a narrow balcony or gallery ringed by iron railings. Here, keepers stepped out to clean the glass, their bodies exposed to the winds, their hands steady as they leaned outward with cloths and scrapers. The view from the gallery was at once breathtaking and humbling, waves stretching endlessly outward, the land distant and small, the tower itself appearing a fragile perch against immensity. Descending from the lantern, one returned again to the oil rooms, the stairwell and finally the base. Attached or nearby stood the keeper's quarters, often built as separate dwellings but linked to the tower by short covered passages or shared foundations. These houses were plain, constructed of wood or brick, their rooms few. A kitchen, a sitting room and 2 or 3 chambers made up the domestic portion. Their furnishings were sparse, a cast iron stove, simple tables, wooden chairs, beds with modest coverings. The walls, when not left bare, were whitewashed, and the ceilings low. Windows admitted light, but rattled in storms, their panes often streaked with salt spray. In these quarters, the tension between duty and domesticity became clear. The house was expected to function as a home, yet its proximity to the tower meant that work was never distant. The smell of oil drifted in, the sound of the lamp's mechanism carried faintly through walls, and the keeper's logbook was often kept on a table where meals were eaten. Families lived in the shadow of the tower, their activities shaped by its demands. Laundry was hung on lines that whipped in sea winds, meals cooked from supplies carried over difficult routes, and evenings passed by lamplight, while the tower's beam swept rhythmically overhead. Beneath the quarters, or in outbuildings, storage for coal, tools and supplies filled every available corner. The architecture admitted no wasted space. Each chamber, passage and shed had a purpose, whether to house oil, preserve food or shelter small livestock. Fences marked boundaries against encroaching sand or marsh, while paths were laid in stone where possible. though often they eroded and required constant repair. The entire station was less a home than a system, its architecture shaped entirely by its obligation to keep the light burning. To walk through such a structure was to feel its singularity, unlike a farmhouse which spoke of growth and harvest, or a city building which suggested commerce and bustle. The lighthouse spoke only of endurance. Its walls bore the marks of storms, its stairs the polish of countless ascents, its lantern room the precision of engineering carried across oceans. For the keeper, the architecture became an extension of his body, the stair his constant exercise, the lantern his constant vigil, the quarters his only refuge. Every surface reflected the balance between permanence and fragility, permanence in stone and iron, fragility in the human figures tasked with maintaining it. Thus, the architecture of the lighthouse was not merely a backdrop but a central character in the keeper's life. It shaped his movements, dictated his routines, and enclosed his solitude within walls that had been built not for comfort but for constancy. In every brick and every step of the spiral stair, the building reminded him that his life was in service to the beam above, and that his dwelling, his duties and his very existence were bound to its light. If the lighthouse tower was an emblem of endurance, then the quarters beside it represented an attempt, fragile and often incomplete, to make endurance habitable. The keeper was rarely alone. While the image of a solitary figure climbing the spiral stair at midnight has endured in story and imagination, the reality was often more complex. Families lived at these stations, wives tending to domestic tasks, children growing up with the sea as their constant companion, and assistants or second keepers sharing duties in places where the workload or the danger was too great for a single man. To understand the rhythm of life at a 19th-century lighthouse, one must step inside these small households, where duty and domesticity overlapped so thoroughly that they could not be distinguished. The family's presence was not accidental but, in many ways, expected. The U.S. Lighthouse Service did not employ wives and children formally, yet it relied upon them. Wives not only cooked and washed but often cleaned the lantern glass, polished brass and kept logs when the keeper was away. Children carried buckets of oil, trimmed wicks under supervision, and later, when old enough, sometimes assumed the duties of a parent who had fallen ill. The station was not divided into separate spheres of work and home. It was a single seamless environment where every task, from preparing a meal to lighting the lamp, contributed to the maintenance of the beacon. The rhythm of the household was shaped by the sea. Morning began not with the crow of a rooster, as it might inland, but with the muted roar of surf and the dampness of salt air filtering through windows and doors. A fire would be coaxed to life in the stove, the iron plates warming slowly, coffee brewed if supplies allowed, and simple fare prepared, bread, salted meat or porridge. The keeper, if he had taken the night watch, might be returning from the tower as the family stirred, his steps slow from fatigue. The wife's work began with chores, scrubbing floors still gritty with sand blown in during storms, patching clothes frayed by wind, and keeping careful watch over limited supplies of flour, sugar and lamp oil. Children, depending on age, assumed roles that would elsewhere have belonged to hired help. They fetched water, gathered driftwood or coal for the stove, and assisted with tending any small garden that could survive in poor coastal soil. Schooling was irregular, sometimes provided by the mother with worn primers, sometimes supplemented by visits from itinerant teachers, and often neglected in favor of practical tasks. Childhood in such places was a mixture of freedom and confinement, the shore a boundless playground of rocks and tide pools, the house a narrow enclosure that demanded discipline and silence during storms or inspections. Meals were central to the family's routine, both as necessity and as brief relief from monotony. Provisions were delivered infrequently, carried by boat or wagon along precarious routes, and so food had to be rationed. Salt pork, dried beans and hardtack formed the backbone of the diet, supplemented by fish if weather allowed for catching, or by garden vegetables in summer. Wives preserved what they could, salting or pickling, though dampness often threatened spoilage. To sit together at a wooden table, sharing a meal while the sea pressed against the walls with its constant noise, was one of the few moments of ordinary domesticity available. The household was also the keeper's unofficial staff. Regulations prescribed cleanliness and order in the quarters, and inspectors would note deficiencies. Thus, wives and children polished brass fixtures, washed curtains, and maintained appearances not for comfort alone, but for compliance with bureaucratic expectation. Even leisure was shaped by necessity. Sewing produced clothing, knitting produced socks, and mending prevented waste. Yet within these constraints, families created small rituals. Evenings might be passed with readings from the Bible, the pages worn from use, or with letter writing, the ink smudging slightly in damp air. On rare occasions, music from a fiddle or harmonica softened the monotony. Life for women at lighthouses was both arduous and distinguished. Many accounts survive of wives who became de facto keepers, taking over duties entirely when their husbands were ill, injured, or deceased. Their names are scattered across records. Ida Lewis of Lime Rock, who rescued mariners while also maintaining the light. Catherine Walker of Robbins Reef, who kept the station after her husband's death. These women were not exceptions but representatives of a broader reality. The lighthouse service may have listed men on its payroll, but the work of keeping lights was in practice often a family enterprise. Children grew into this life with a mixture of resignation and attachment. Some left eagerly at the first opportunity, seeking employment inland or at sea, unwilling to continue the isolation. Others remained, applying formally to succeed their fathers as keepers. Their memories, when recorded later, often describe childhoods of strange solitude. No neighbors, few playmates, but an intimate acquaintance with tides, winds, and storms. Their games were improvised from what the environment provided, their imaginations shaped by the constant presence of the tower and the light above. Storms altered everything. When weather turned violent, the household contracted into a single unit of endurance. Windows rattled, shingles lifted, and spray lashed against walls. Families huddled in kitchens or bedrooms, listening to the ceaseless pounding outside. The keeper, meanwhile, climbed again and again to the lantern, ensuring the light remained steady. In such hours, wives and children not only waited but prayed, and sometimes worked, bringing fuel, preparing warm food, or simply staying awake through the night. The domestic world, fragile at the best of times, became almost spectral during storms, reduced to little more than endurance within fragile walls. Visitors were rare, and so the family learned to rely on itself. Inspectors arrived periodically, their presence disrupting routine, their notebooks filled with observations about orderliness and efficiency. Supply boats came at intervals, bringing not only barrels and boxes but fragments of news from beyond. These moments punctuated otherwise seamless weeks and months. Letters delivered from distant relatives might be read and reread, their paper softening from handling, their ink fading slowly. To the family, such communication was both lifeline and reminder, proof of connection to a wider world, yet also of their separation from it. In this way, the household of the keeper became a paradox. It was both ordinary and extraordinary, both domestic and official. The wife was at once homemaker and assistant keeper. The children were at once dependents and laborers. Their lives were tethered entirely to the beam above them, their rhythms dictated by its need for tending. If the lamp faltered, their meals, their lessons, their very rest could be interrupted. And yet, within this unyielding framework, they created a semblance of home, fragile but persistent, sustained by habit, ritual, and shared endurance. To speak of the keeper's family, then, is to speak of quiet heroism. They did not choose the spotlight, nor did they often receive recognition. Yet without them, the stations would have faltered, the keepers would have failed, and the lights themselves might have gone dark. Their presence at the edge of the sea turned isolated towers into lived spaces, their small acts of maintenance and survival, interwoven with the larger duty of guiding ships safely past. The architecture provided walls and stairs, but it was the family who animated them, making of stone and oil a life that endured against the endless rhythm of the waves. Mourning for the lighthouse keeper was less a beginning than a continuation. The day did not so much start as flow seamlessly out of the work of the night before. When the first grey light touched the horizon, The keeper, whether bleary from long hours or fortified by habit, began the set of rituals that defined every dawn. The sun's rising marked the time when the lamp was extinguished, and so the keeper's first act was to tend to the light itself, a process at once simple and exacting, repeated daily with the same deliberate care. For any negligence here would be visible, not only to inspectors, but to the mariners who relied upon the beam. The lantern room, still cool from night air, held the scent of burned oil and faint traces of soot that clung invisibly to the glass and the fittings. The keeper began by extinguishing the flame, carefully adjusting the wick or shutter to bring the great lamp to rest. What remained was residue, the charred wick ends, the thin film of soot on the chimney or the lens, and the subtle accumulation of ash or oil that clung to the metal. These were not dramatic remnants but quiet, persistent traces of the night's labor. To ignore them would mean inefficiency the next evening, so they were dealt with in the pale light of morning. Cleaning was precise. Wicks were trimmed, their blackened ends cut neatly to prepare for another evening's burning. The lamp glass was wiped with cloths kept solely for this purpose, washed and dried to avoid streaking. Brass fittings were polished until they shone, not for beauty alone, but because a reflective surface performed better and lasted longer. Regulations demanded that all this be done thoroughly. An inspector might arrive unannounced and run a finger along a surface, noting in his book any sign of neglect. For the keeper, habit and necessity blended into a kind of meditative rhythm, cloth against glass, knife against wick, hand against metal. The great Fresnel lens required particular attention. Its many prisms caught the early sunlight now, scattering faint rainbows across the lantern room. Dust and soot were wiped carefully from each surface, for any obscurity would scatter the beam unevenly at night. The work was slow, and often done in silence, broken only by the sound of cloth against glass and the distant wash of waves below. Some keepers described this task as one of the most consuming of the day, not physically strenuous but requiring patience, precision, and a willingness to repeat the same motions endlessly, day after day, year after year. Once the lamp was extinguished, cleaned and prepared, the keeper recorded the first entry of the day in the station's logbook. The log was more than a notebook. It was the official record of the light's operation, an object that inspectors examined closely, and one that might be used in inquiries should an accident occur nearby. Entries were plain and factual, noting the time of extinguishing, the state of the lamp, the weather conditions, and sometimes small remarks about supplies or the condition of the building. Phrases were brief, stripped of ornament, their economy reflecting both the bureaucratic formality of the service and the keeper's own fatigue. Yet over months and years, these lines accumulated into a record of endurance, a day-by-day account of a life tethered to routine. After the light was tended and the log completed, the keeper descended the spiral stair, each step echoing slightly in the confined shaft. The air grew cooler, the smell of oil fainter, until at last the door opened into the quarters below. Here, morning in the domestic sense began. The family, if present, would be stirring. A wife preparing breakfast, children fetching water or wood, the clatter of pots and the faint warmth of a stove, replacing the austere silence of the lantern room. Yet even in this domestic sphere, duty lingered. Clothes smelled faintly of oil, hands bore stains from wicks, and conversation, if any, often revolved around supplies, weather, or the endless work of maintenance. For keepers stationed alone, the descent from the lantern to the quarters carried a sharper contrast. The rooms were silent, the table bare, the hearth cold, unless he himself had prepared it. Breakfast might be nothing more than bread and coffee, eaten in solitude while the sea pressed endlessly at the windows. The logbook lay nearby, its ink still drying from the morning's entry, a reminder that his life was as much recorded as lived. For such men, the morning was not marked by human interaction, but by the continuity of duty, the extinguishing of the light, the cleaning of the lamp, the writing of the record, and the slow passage into the day's other tasks. The rhythm of morning also extended outward, to the station grounds. After the lamp was secured, the keeper inspected the exterior. Windows might need wiping of salt spray, paths cleared of sand or debris, fences checked for storm damage. Chickens, if the family kept them, were fed, gardens, if soil permitted, were watered or weeded. The morning was thus a convergence of two worlds, the highly regulated, mechanical care of the lamp, and the practical domestic care of the household. Together they formed a continuum, one that began at the very top of the tower, and ended in the earth outside its base. Weather shaped everything. A calm morning meant work done with ease, sun warming the tower walls, the sea a steady shimmer. A stormy morning meant lamps extinguished against fierce winds, cleaning done while rain lashed the glass, log entries written with damp sleeves brushing the page. In either case, the tasks did not change. They were constants, repeated regardless of season, tide, or circumstance. The sea might rage or lie still, but the lamp was extinguished, the wicks trimmed, the brass polished, the log written. In this way, the keeper's morning was not simply a preparation for the day, but a ritual of closure and renewal. Each dawn brought an end to the night's vigil, yet also the beginning of readiness for the next. The work was circular, as unending as the sweep of the beam itself. The keeper did not rise to meet novelty or surprise, but to repeat what had been done yesterday, and what would be done tomorrow. The morning, like the lighthouse, was a structure of endurance, quiet, methodical, unchanging, yet essential. If the morning extinguishing of the lamp brought closure to the night, the hours that followed were filled with the quieter yet unrelenting duties of maintenance. These tasks were repetitive, ordinary, and unvarying, but within the world of the lighthouse they assumed an importance that was absolute. A ship's captain might never see the polished brass or spotless glass of the lantern room, but the clarity of the beam, the steadiness of the mechanism, and the durability of the tower itself depended upon this unseen meticulous labor. For the keeper, maintenance was not a separate category of work, but the very framework of existence, a series of chores that stretched across every day without deviation. The lighthouse service demanded cleanliness, and it demanded it in writing. Inspectors traveled from station to station with notebooks in hand, marking infractions as small as streaks on a lens or corrosion on a hinge. They expected brass to gleam, glass to shine, and floors to be scrubbed free of sand and soot. Their authority was not symbolic. A keeper's position, and his livelihood, might be jeopardized by repeated failures in upkeep. Thus, every cloth stroke, every polished surface, every trimmed wick was carried out not simply from pride or necessity, but from the knowledge of constant scrutiny, invisible most of the time yet always looming. The day's chores began most often in the lantern room, for the lamp was the heart of the station. Even after the morning's cleaning, additional polishing was done. The Fresnel lens, with its many prisms and rings, required patient attention, each surface wiped with cloths kept carefully separate from those used elsewhere. Brass fittings, the gallery railings, the lamp mechanism, the hinges of the lantern door, were rubbed until they shone faintly in daylight. The keeper's movements here were measured, his eyes scanning for smudges or streaks that could scatter light. Even the floor of the lantern room was swept and washed, its iron or wood kept free of dust and ash. Descending into the stairwell, the chores continued. Stairs were swept, their narrow treads scrubbed periodically to remove soot carried up by the keeper's own boots. All windows set deep into the masonry were washed, salt spray scraped from glass, their iron frames inspected for rust. In oil rooms, cans were wiped clean, lids tightened, the floor kept free of spilled drops. Spilled oil was not merely unsightly, it was dangerous, its vapors lingering in the confined space, its stains difficult to remove. Regulations instructed keepers to avoid even the appearance of disorder, and so hours were spent keeping rooms not only functional but spotless. Brass polishing became a symbol of the keeper's life. Every station had its fittings, lamp components, hinges, doorknobs, or tools, and each had to shine. The work was endless because salt air corroded surfaces with relentless persistence. What gleamed one week would dull the next, requiring the process to begin again. Keepers kept supplies of cloths, polishes and powders, their use so habitual that the faint metallic scent of brass polish mixed permanently with the odors of oil and sea air. It was not uncommon for inspectors to note approvingly in their reports, "brass in good order," a phrase that, while small, represented hours of unacknowledged labor. The lenses, too, demanded constant care. The Fresnel design, though a marvel of engineering, was delicate. Smudges or dust could diminish its capacity, and so every surface had to be treated with vigilance. Keepers worked slowly around the circumference, cleaning pane by pane, sometimes repeating the process twice in a day. If storms had blown in grit or salt, on clear mornings, the prisms caught the sun, scattering color across the floor as the keeper moved, a silent, momentary spectacle seen by no one but himself. Yet even this beauty was secondary to duty. The colors would vanish, the surfaces would dull, and the cloth would continue to wipe, polish and restore. Beyond the lantern, the rest of the station required equal care. Stone or brick walls inside the quarters were scrubbed of damp mold, wooden floors were scoured with sand, windows were washed despite their inevitable streaking from salt spray. The keeper's wife, if present, often bore a share of these duties, her hands as familiar with polish and scrub brush as with pot and needle. Children assisted too, learning early that the household was not only a home but an extension of government property, and that disorder could not be tolerated. Outside, maintenance took on heavier forms. Paths had to be cleared of drifting sand, stones set back into place, fences repaired, and cisterns checked. Rust was scraped from hinges and gates, paint reapplied in bright white or red stripes to keep towers visible. Storms undid much of this work, requiring constant repetition. Shingles torn loose were nailed back, windows broken by wind-borne debris were replaced, gardens replanted after being scoured by salt. The sea was not an adversary in a dramatic sense but in a constant, gnawing one, and maintenance was the keeper's quiet reply, repeated endlessly without expectation of final victory. The monotony of these chores was profound. To polish brass day after day, to scrub stairs that would never remain clean, to wipe lenses that would gather soot again each night. This was labor without finish, labor in circles, yet within this monotony lay the essence of the keeper's existence. He was not there to complete a task but to repeat it. Ships passed unseen at night, their captains perhaps noting only a steady light, never knowing that its steadiness was guaranteed by hours of unseen scrubbing, trimming and polishing. Inspections underscored this reality. When an officer arrived, he would note in detail the condition of lamp, lens, quarters, and grounds. A spotless station reflected well on the keeper, earning commendation, sometimes a rare letter of praise. A neglected one could lead to reprimand or dismissal. These inspections gave the chores their weight. They were not optional acts of pride, but obligations enforced by bureaucracy. The lighthouse, though isolated, was not beyond reach of oversight, and every polished hinge and scrubbed stair was an answer to the invisible gaze of the service. In this way, the chores of maintenance filled the keeper's day and shaped his life. They were repetitive to the point of invisibility, yet essential. Without them, the tower would falter, the light would fail, and the very purpose of the station would be lost. To polish brass was to maintain not only metal, but the trust of mariners. To scrub a stair was to preserve not only cleanliness but continuity. For the keeper, each chore was a small, humble act within a system larger than himself, a system that demanded repetition, rewarded vigilance, and remembered neglect. And so, in the long daylight hours between extinguishing the lamp and preparing it again for nightfall, the keeper polished, scrubbed, and maintained. His world was defined not by change but by return, not by completion but by constancy. Every cloth stroke, every trimmed wick, every polished fitting was another step in an endless cycle, one that stretched across days, years and lifetimes, as steady and unchanging as the beam itself that swept across the sea. If the interior of the lighthouse demanded polish, order and scrubbing, the exterior required a different kind of care. Here, the keeper faced not soot and brass but salt, wind and ceaseless erosion. The grounds of a lighthouse station were small, often nothing more than a patch of rock, a stretch of sand, or a narrow spit of grass clinging to soil perpetually under siege from storms. Yet these grounds mattered. They were the keeper's immediate world, the visible expression of the station's orderliness, and the first thing an inspector or visiting supply boat would see. The tending of paths, fences, gardens and boats became as much a part of daily duty as trimming the lamp. The fences, plain and utilitarian, marked boundaries against livestock or encroaching sand. On islands or promontories, They kept chickens or goats from wandering, and in some stations they served simply to indicate property lines. Yet the wind pressed against them constantly, loosening posts, rattling boards and rusting hinges. A keeper walked the perimeter with hammer and nails, resetting boards, driving stakes deeper, replacing sections washed out by spray. To keep a fence upright was to engage in a quiet battle with the elements, a battle never won, only fought again and again after each storm. Gardens, though modest, were often necessary. Fresh vegetables were scarce on remote coasts, and supply boats might be delayed for weeks. A patch of potatoes, onions or cabbages offered variety against the monotony of salted meat and hard bread. But soil near the sea was thin, sandy and poor. Salt spray scorched leaves, winds tore at seedlings, and gulls picked freely if fences failed. Families bent to this task with persistence, scraping compost from scraps, hauling buckets of fresh water when cisterns allowed, and shielding plants with makeshift windbreaks. These gardens rarely thrived, but often survived, producing enough to supplement stores and to remind the family of a more ordinary domestic rhythm, one faintly resembling life inland. Boats, when present, represented lifelines. A keeper stationed on an island depended upon them for supplies, for mail, and sometimes for rescue. Maintenance was constant, hulls scraped of barnacles, seams caulked, oars checked for cracks. Even when not in use, boats required care, for the sea would claim them quickly if left neglected. They were drawn up on rocky beaches, turned on their sides against storms, patched and tarred under the keeper's steady hand. The smell of pitch mingled with that of salt air, a sharp reminder that even small neglect could mean isolation when storms cut off access to the mainland. Pathways, though less visible to the outside world, carried symbolic weight. Inspectors arriving unannounced expected not only a well-tended lantern, but also orderly grounds. A stone path leading from dwelling to tower, if covered in weeds or broken by washouts, might be noted in a report. Thus keepers spent hours setting stones back in place, clearing sand with shovels, and cutting back grasses where soil allowed. These paths bore the imprint of countless footsteps, their wear reflecting not traffic but repetition, the same movements carried out each day as duty directed. To walk a cleared path was to affirm order against the sea's ceaseless disorder. Other structures required attention. Sheds where tools and supplies were kept, cisterns for storing water, and sometimes small piers for boats, each weathered under the same relentless exposure. Shingles loosened, boards warped, hinges rusted. The keeper patched what he could with what he had, often improvising repairs until supply runs brought new materials. Nails were hammered again and again into damp wood, paint applied when available, tar brushed onto roofs to resist leaks. There was no final completion, only intervals of temporary soundness before the next storm forced renewal. Animals, where kept, added further responsibility. Chickens needed coops reinforced against wind. Goats required pens secured against wandering. Their presence added noise and a sense of life to otherwise silent stations, yet they also multiplied chores, feeding, cleaning, mending enclosures. Their survival, like that of the family itself, depended on the keeper's steady attention to the unending cycle of repair. The grounds were also a stage for solitude. On calm days, the keeper walked them slowly, inspecting, repairing, carrying tools in silence. The horizon stretched on every side, unbroken, except for the sweep of the light above. Each task, hammer striking nail, shovel scraping sand, hands pulling weeds, took place against a backdrop of vast emptiness. Ships passed at a distance, their sails or smokestacks visible for brief moments. Yet the keeper remained anchored in his small world of paths, fences and gardens. Storms undid this work with ruthless efficiency. A single night of high seas could flatten fences, scatter tools, flood cisterns and bury paths under sand. After such events, the keeper emerged to survey damage, walking the perimeter as though retracing a map erased by the sea. Repairs began immediately, posts reset, boards collected, pathways cleared again. The rhythm was wearying, the sense of futility palpable, yet duty admitted no exceptions. Grounds had to appear orderly, even if their order could last only until the next gale. Inspections punctuated this rhythm. The arrival of an official brought scrutiny, not only to the lamp, but to the very appearance of the station. A weeded path, a repaired fence, a freshly painted shed, all spoke of diligence. Neglect, however minor, could be marked against the keeper's record. Thus, even the smallest acts of outdoor maintenance carried weight. The grounds were not only lived space but a kind of report, silently conveying whether the keeper had been faithful to his charge. In tending to the grounds, the keeper engaged in work that mirrored his inner life. The endless repetition of repair reflected the endless repetition of his days. Just as the lamp demanded nightly vigilance, the fences demanded seasonal renewal. Just as the lens needed daily polishing, the paths needed clearing after each storm. Nothing was ever finished, and yet everything had to be maintained. The grounds, like the tower, embodied the principle of constancy, to stand against erosion, not in triumph, but in steady persistence. And so the keeper moved through these chores with quiet patience. Hammering boards, weeding soil, scraping boats, he wove his life into the fragile spaces between land and sea. The grounds never flourished, never expanded, never changed much at all, yet they were tended with care, for they were the keeper's world, a small enclosed stage, where the vastness of ocean and sky pressed endlessly against the fragile persistence of human order. Noon at a lighthouse was not marked by bells or crowds, but by the subtle shift of light, the sun crossing the zenith, and the quiet awareness that half the day had passed in service of the lamp, the lens and the station itself. These hours were the quietest of the day. The morning's tasks, extinguishing the lamp, cleaning residue, maintaining surfaces, tending grounds had been completed, leaving the keeper with time that could be claimed neither entirely by leisure nor entirely by duty. In these hours, the monotony of life by the sea deepened, and the small acts of ordinary existence became intertwined with the ever-present knowledge of the light's return in the evening. A meal at midday was modest. The table might bear bread, salted meat, perhaps some vegetables saved from the garden, and water or coffee if supplies permitted. There was no urgency, for no bell or signal dictated the meal, only the practical sense of sustenance and the awareness that food would be needed to sustain the labor that remained. The smell of sea and oil mingled in the quarters, faintly sharp, and often lingered on hands, clothing and furniture. Eating was both ritual and pause, the briefest interval in which the keeper's body was not wholly devoted to the endless cycle of maintenance. During these hours, correspondence was often attended to. Letters from family, friends, or government offices might have arrived with supply boats or by special delivery, their paper damp or edges frayed by travel. The keeper wrote replies carefully, mindful that letters might take weeks or months to reach their destination. Pen and ink moved slowly across pages, each word deliberate, the act itself meditative. Sometimes the letters were purely personal, expressions of concern for distant relatives, accounts of life on the station, or minor observations of storms and tides. At other times they carried official notes or responses, small communications that documented the day-to-day operation of the station beyond the logbook. Secondary duties filled the remaining hours. These could include sharpening tools, preparing wicks for evening use, mending clothing or uniforms, or checking storage rooms to ensure that provisions were in order. Each task, though minor, contributed to the smooth operation of the station. Even in these quieter moments, the keeper's attention was divided, for the horizon outside offered no certainty. Storms could arrive without warning, supply boats could be delayed, and the next night's vigilance demanded readiness. Thus, even rest was provisional, and even eating or letter writing was performed with an undercurrent of alertness. The midday hours were also those of contemplation and observation. From the tower or the quarters, the keeper could watch the unbroken expanse of sea, the patterns of tides and wind, the distant movement of vessels. These observations were rarely recorded formally, except in the logbook, but they informed the keeper's sense of the world, guiding expectations for weather and navigation. Even silence carried meaning. The absence of ships, the stillness of waves, or the cry of a gull indicated subtle shifts in the environment, which the keeper learned to interpret almost instinctively. Isolation during noon was profound. Visitors were rare, and the world beyond the station seemed distant. muffled by the stretch of sea and rock. The hours were unhurried, yet laden with quiet tension, for the keeper remained alone with both responsibility and expectation. In many ways these hours were a mirror of life itself at the lighthouse, repetitive, disciplined, quiet, yet always conscious of the consequences of neglect. The noonlight poured across floors, glinting off polished brass and glass, illuminating in stark relief the order maintained by patient labor. Families, if present, used this time for their own tasks. Wives might continue household work, tending fires, scrubbing floors, or preserving food. Children assisted as needed, or played within the confined spaces, improvising games from the surrounding objects and landscape. Their activities, while small and seemingly inconsequential, maintained a rhythm to the station, a reminder that life continued beyond the mechanical repetition of lamp care. Meals were shared quietly, letters read aloud or responded to, and the day moved forward in unbroken, gentle progress. Evening duties, while still hours away, began to inform the rhythm of noon. Preparations for relighting the lamp involved checking supplies, trimming additional wicks, and ensuring that oil reservoirs were full and functioning. The keeper's attention oscillated between the immediate tasks and the approaching cycle, reinforcing a sense of time as circular rather than linear. Each noon was both continuation and prelude, a quiet interlude threaded into the longer narrative of daily vigilance. By mid-afternoon, the day's quieter labors began to taper, leaving the keeper to wait in the soft diffused light. Time stretched, marked only by the movement of shadows across the station, the rhythmic crash of waves, and the occasional cry of seabirds. For those stationed in extreme isolation, these hours could feel particularly extended, a suspended moment in which the world beyond the horizon seemed unreal, the light above the sea remaining the only constant. Yet even this suspension was punctuated by preparation, cleaning tending tools, and reviewing the logbook to ensure that all records were up to date before nightfall. In this way, noon at the lighthouse was an hour of quiet endurance. It was neither the intensity of night watch, nor the motion of morning chores, but a slow, deliberate passage, where duty and stillness intertwined. Meals, correspondence, secondary tasks and observation were woven into a seamless pattern of attention, repetition, and anticipation. The keeper lived through these hours, with an awareness of solitude, a consciousness of the sea's permanence, and a patient acceptance of the station's unending requirements. Noon was thus not a peak or climax of the day, but a measured silent rhythm, a meditation of order amidst isolation, a soft interlude in the perpetual vigilance demanded by the lighthouse. Life at a lighthouse was defined by cycles of repetition, but occasionally, the quiet monotony was punctuated by the rare and anticipated arrival of a supply ship. These vessels were not frequent visitors. They arrived only at intervals, their schedules dictated by weather, tides, and the challenges of navigation along often treacherous coasts. Yet, when they did appear on the horizon, their presence transformed the station from a self-contained cyclical world into one momentarily connected to the broader rhythms of human life and commerce. Even this brief contact, however, was defined by careful observation and measured activity, rather than excitement or haste. The sight of a ship approaching from the sea required a quiet alertness. Its masts rose against the horizon, sails catching the wind, moving slowly toward the station. Keepers observed it carefully, noting its angle, speed, and probable point of landing. No dramatics accompanied this monitoring. It was the product of learned attention, a subtle vigilance developed over months or years of isolation. Families often paused in their domestic tasks to watch the approach, children leaning against windowsills, adults exchanging quiet observations about wind direction and tide levels. The ship itself, though tangible, remained a distant, almost ghostly figure until it drew closer to shore. Landing supplies was an intricate and deliberate process. Barrels of oil were first secured, moved carefully to prevent leakage or spillage. Boxes of provisions followed, often containing salted meats, dried beans, flour, sugar, and other essentials that sustained the family and the lamp alike. Replacement wicks, meticulously measured and prepared, were distributed for use in upcoming nights, ensuring that the lamp's flame would remain steady. Even newspapers arrived occasionally, their presence a brief reminder of the wider world, of news, events and conversations taking place far beyond the station. These items, while mundane in appearance, carried immense weight in their implications, sustaining life, duty and connection to the mainland. The transfer of goods required physical labor performed with careful rhythm. Barrels were rolled along the rocky shore, or hoisted with ropes from small boats. Boxes were unsealed and checked, oil poured into storage containers, and every item catalogued according to lighthouse service requirements. The process was methodical. Mistakes could be costly, whether due to loss of valuable fuel, spoilage of food or misplacement of tools. Each movement was deliberate, measured against the unyielding attention demanded by the service and the practical challenges of uneven terrain, shifting tides, and the occasional gust of wind sweeping across the station. Families participated in these tasks when present, their labor an extension of the station's routines. Wives and children helped move containers, sort provisions and store perishable items. Children often carried small parcels, or assisted in securing ropes, learning through repetition the careful balance of weight, timing and coordination required to avoid accidents. The work was quiet, punctuated by the occasional instruction from the keeper, the scrape of barrels against boards, and the distant lapping of waves. Even in these moments of shared effort, the tone of the station remained calm, almost ritualized, rather than hurried or festive. The arrival of supplies also demanded a careful inspection of the contents. Oil barrels were checked for leaks, boxes examined for spoilage or water damage, and wicks counted and organized. Logs were updated with meticulous attention. Quantities received, stored, and allocated were recorded in accordance with regulations. The lighthouse was a small isolated node in a larger system, and the keeper's diligence ensured that this link functioned smoothly. The act of receiving supplies was thus both practical and symbolic, a moment in which the isolated station reaffirmed its connection to the wider network of maritime safety. Occasionally news arrived in the form of newspapers, letters or small printed announcements. These items were treated with care, their pages spread out to be read slowly and deliberately. For families they provided a glimpse into a world otherwise inaccessible, an awareness of the rhythms of towns and cities far removed from the unchanging cycle of tides and wind. Yet even this exposure was limited and measured. The lighthouse remained a place dominated by labor and repetition, and reading was an interlude rather than a break. Newspapers were often read aloud to family members, or their contents summarized, creating a small ritual of communal attention within the otherwise quiet station. The arrival of the supply ship, while brief, was a subtle reminder of human persistence and coordination beyond the tower. The effort of sailors navigating treacherous waters, the careful scheduling of deliveries, the labor of unloading and distributing goods, all of it intertwined with the keeper's own routines, reinforcing the notion that the lighthouse, though isolated, was embedded in larger networks of care, oversight and provision. Yet even in this connection, the station's pace remained slow. Tasks were performed deliberately, movements repeated with care, and the work continued in measured silence. Once the supplies were secured, catalogued and stored, the keeper resumed his regular duties. Barrels placed in the oil room, boxes stacked neatly in the storeroom, wicks prepared for evening use. Each item returned to the steady cycle of maintenance that defined daily life. The ship's departure, often just as quietly as its arrival, left behind only traces, the stored provisions, the faint smell of salt and tar, and the subtle reassurance that the station could continue functioning until the next delivery. For the family and the keeper alike, this brief interlude reinforced the rhythm of endurance, preparation, vigilance, and the steady repetition of labor, repeated endlessly against the backdrop of the sea. Thus, the supply ship was both extraordinary and ordinary, a rare event, yet one seamlessly integrated into the continuous cycle of lighthouse life. Its arrival marked attention, labor, and connection, yet it altered nothing about the underlying demands of isolation and duty. The station returned to its quiet persistence, the lamp waiting to be lit again, the grounds maintained, and the family continuing their daily rhythms, all sustained by the modest but essential deliveries that had arrived with the vessel. In this way, the supply ship was a fleeting moment of interaction with the wider world, yet one entirely framed by the constant unbroken cadence of life at the lighthouse. Amid the cycles of daily maintenance, meals and minor labors, there occasionally arrived a figure whose presence introduced a quiet tension into the otherwise steady rhythm of lighthouse life. The inspector. These officials traveled the coasts with a meticulous system of observation, their role to ensure that the stations met the exacting standards set by the United States Lighthouse Service. Their visits were infrequent, but they carried weight far beyond their duration. For the keeper and family, the inspector's arrival was a subtle disturbance, a reminder that their isolated diligence was continuously under evaluation, that every polished surface, trimmed wick, and cleared path might be measured against a ledger, a report, or an official notation. The approach of an inspector was seldom dramatic. Often they arrived quietly, by small boat or on horseback, their movements deliberate and understated. The keeper would observe the vessel or rider from the tower, or from the shore, noting their progress while simultaneously attending to ongoing tasks. Preparations were made with care, windows wiped, grounds tidied, floors swept, lamps checked for dust or smudge. Though the family may have continued their daily routines, a subtle shift in energy marked the anticipation. Even the air seemed heavier, laden with unspoken scrutiny, the ordinary movements of the household infused with heightened awareness. Inspections themselves were methodical and precise. The inspector moved through the station in measured order, beginning often with the lantern room, where the lamp and Fresnel lens were examined in detail. Every component was scrutinized, the clarity of the glass, the polish of the brass, the proper functioning of the mechanism, the correct trimming of wicks. Notes were taken, measurements made, and minor imperfections recorded. The keeper, standing quietly to the side, performed any minor demonstrations requested, confirming the readiness of equipment and adherence to the standards mandated by service regulations. The process could take hours, depending on the thoroughness of the inspector, and demanded patience and precision, for even a small flaw might be noted in the report. The inspector's attention then moved to the quarters and grounds. Floors were examined for cleanliness, furniture for wear, and windows for salt and grime. Fences were walked, gardens inspected, and boats checked for seaworthiness. The inspector did not hurry, rather, the pace was deliberate, ensuring that every aspect of the station reflected the standards expected. The keeper's family often participated in small silent ways, ensuring that domestic areas were orderly, while children, if present, might quietly observe, learning early the unyielding logic of bureaucratic evaluation. Even the most trivial seeming details, a stray brush, a misplaced tool, were noted, a reminder that diligence extended beyond lamp care to every facet of life at the station. Reports written following inspections carried consequences. A positive evaluation could secure the keeper's reputation, offer the comfort of approval, and sometimes influence future assignments or promotions. Negative remarks, even minor, could result in reprimand, reduced standing, or the need for immediate correction of deficiencies. The knowledge of these potential outcomes added weight to every gesture and movement during an inspection. Even after the inspector departed, the keeper would review the report carefully, noting suggestions, corrections, or commendations, and immediately adjusting routines to align with expectations. The evaluation became a silent framework, guiding the station's operations, shaping every daily task that followed. Inspection days also disrupted the station's sense of monotony. Work that normally proceeded at its own slow pace was accelerated and performed with heightened attention. Surfaces polished again, paths reswept, lamps checked and double-checked, oil carefully measured. Yet the keeper had learned that perfection in one day could not replace the steady diligence of months. Inspections were an intermittent confirmation rather than a remedy. They punctuated the rhythm of life, imposing temporary intensity within the long, steady cadence of unending labor. Anxiety, though never dramatic, was palpable. The inspector represented accountability, an impartial authority whose judgments could affect livelihood, reputation, and sometimes career trajectory. Keepers and families carried a quiet awareness of potential scrutiny throughout the visit, their movements guided by both habit and the subtle undercurrent of evaluation. Even children absorbed this tension, observing the slow, precise procedures, understanding that the well-ordered house, polished brass, and clear paths were not merely domestic concerns but markers of discipline and reliability. Yet, despite the weight of scrutiny, the visit also reaffirmed the purpose of the station. The inspector's gaze, though critical, underscored the essential nature of the work performed daily: lamps maintained, lenses cleaned, paths cleared, fences repaired. All these acts were recognized as fundamental to maritime safety. In this sense, inspections were a quiet acknowledgement of diligence, an official nod to the invisible labor that kept ships safe and coastlines marked. After the inspector departed, the station settled once more into its slow rhythm. The grounds, lamps and quarters returned to their ordinary pace. Tasks resumed with the familiar cadence: oil measured, wicks trimmed, floors scrubbed, logs updated. Yet the presence of evaluation lingered in subtle ways, a reminder that order and diligence were continuous obligations, not occasional performances. The inspection became a quiet anchor in the rhythm of lighthouse life, a marker against which the unending cycles of duty and maintenance could be measured. In this way, the inspector's visit was both disruption and confirmation. It introduced anxiety yet reinforced purpose. It imposed temporary intensity yet affirmed enduring diligence. The keeper, having navigated the methodical scrutiny, returned to the daily cycles with a renewed awareness of the balance between isolation and accountability, repetition and responsibility, solitude and service. It was a quiet, measured interlude, shaping the rhythm of life without altering its fundamental slow, deliberate pace. The afternoon at a lighthouse was a time of subdued labor, a bridge between the day's earlier work and the approaching responsibilities of night. It was not marked by excitement or urgency, but by quiet attention and methodical repetition. The morning tasks had been completed, the midday meal eaten, correspondence tended, and sometimes a supply ship had arrived and departed, leaving behind barrels of oil, boxes of provisions, and the faint reassurance of connection to the wider world. Now the keeper entered the long hours before sunset, a period defined by minor duties, slow movement, and careful preparation for the return of the lamp's nightly vigilance. Records demanded attention. The keeper's logbook, maintained with exacting regularity, was reviewed and updated. Observations recorded earlier in the day, weather conditions, ship movements, minor repairs were checked for accuracy, and additional notes were added. These entries were not hurried. Each sentence was deliberate, the ink allowed to dry fully, the pages carefully kept to ensure clarity and permanence. The logbook was more than a bureaucratic formality. It was a continuous account of the station's life, a document reflecting the quiet constancy of the keeper's labor and the ongoing interaction with the environment. Small repairs filled the hours. A hinge that had begun to rust, a window frame weakened by wind and salt, a fence post slightly loosened, all received attention in the measured rhythm characteristic of the station. Tools were laid out and used with precision, hammers lifted, nails driven slowly, screwdrivers turned with deliberate care. Each motion was repeated until the repair met both practical and regulatory standards. Even the smallest imperfection could, in principle, be noted by an inspector, and the keeper's diligence ensured that nothing remained unattended. The labor was repetitive, yet each action reinforced the station's continuity, its readiness, and its endurance against the persistent forces of weather and time. Preparation for night was a subtle, ongoing process during the afternoon. Oil reservoirs were checked, refilled if necessary, and carefully wiped to remove drips or residue. Wicks were inspected, trimmed, and stored in readiness. Lenses were cleaned once more, the brass fittings polished to a soft sheen. These tasks were not performed in haste. Rather, they were woven into the slow cadence of the afternoon, each act a quiet rehearsal for the vigilance that would be required when darkness fell and the lamp's light would once again sweep across the waves. Domestic routines, if the keeper had a family, were interlaced with these tasks. Stoves might be prepared for evening meals, floors swept again, windows checked for drafts or salt spray. Children might play quietly within the station, observed intermittently, while adults moved slowly from one chore to another. There was no urgency, but a continuity, a sense of maintaining order within the constrained environment. Every minor act, polishing, sweeping, checking logs, adjusting oil, was a thread in the uninterrupted tapestry of lighthouse life. Observation of the sea and sky also persisted in these hours. The keeper's attention, while focused on small tasks, remained attuned to the environment. Clouds were noted for shape and color, the horizon scanned for ships, the behavior of tides recorded. These observations, while secondary to chores, informed preparation for the night ahead, allowing the keeper to anticipate weather conditions that might affect the lamp or the safety of vessels. Even in the calm routine pace of afternoon, the demands of vigilance persisted quietly, shaping every movement and decision. Afternoons were also a time for reflection, though often unconscious. The repetition of tasks, the monotony of surroundings, the slow passage of shadows across walls and floors, encouraged a kind of meditative attention. Each chore, each minor repair, each log entry reinforced the constancy of life at the station, a life governed not by sudden events or dramatic encounters, but by the steady accumulation of small, careful acts. In this way, the afternoon bridged the visible work of day and the anticipatory labor of night, forming a continuous, unbroken cycle. Evenings would eventually demand greater intensity. The lamp required careful lighting, the lens and prism assembled and polished, the ground secured, and the family prepared for hours of darkness illuminated only by the beam. But the afternoon was the quiet prelude, the slow accumulation of readiness, the time in which minor duties ensured that the transition to night would be smooth. There was no excitement in this period, only deliberate, repeated labor, a rhythm that defined the lighthouse as a space apart from the wider world. In this way, the keeper's afternoon was both ordinary and essential. It was filled with minor, unglamorous acts, yet each was necessary to maintain the operation and safety of the station. The labor was cyclical, repeated endlessly, measured not by completion but by diligence. By the end of the afternoon, the station had been maintained, preparations were in place, and the keeper, patient and deliberate, was ready to meet the coming darkness with the same steady attention that had defined every moment of the day. Even in the isolated stillness of a lighthouse, there existed a quiet sanctuary of thought, reflection, and occasional escape. The keeper's library. This was rarely a library in the conventional sense. It was more often a small collection of books and papers, carefully preserved, quietly read and methodically arranged. Its contents reflected both the practical demands of the station and the personal inclinations of those who lived there, bridging the distance between a solitary post on the edge of the sea and the broader intellectual world beyond. Nautical charts formed the core of this collection. These maps, meticulously detailed, showed coastlines, shoals, channels, and navigational hazards. They were not decorative, nor were they casually consulted. They were essential instruments of understanding. A keeper might study them while considering the trajectory of tides, the patterns of prevailing winds, or the routes of passing vessels. The charts were often large, printed on thick paper, with annotations made in careful ink, recording observations gathered over years of observation. Even in moments of calm, they demanded attention, a silent reminder of the station's purpose to aid safe navigation. Logbooks were another constant feature. Beyond the official daily records required by the lighthouse service, keepers often maintained personal journals. These chronicled weather, sea conditions, unusual events, or even personal reflections. The pages were often worn, the ink faded in places, yet the careful recording offered a means of preserving time in a place where days otherwise blurred together. Writing in the logbook became a meditative act, reinforcing discipline while providing a quiet outlet for thought. Each entry was deliberate, a record not only of duty but of perception, a tether between solitary labor and enduring memory. Religious texts, particularly the Bible, were frequently found in lighthouse homes. They provided moral guidance, structured meditation, and a sense of continuity with cultural and spiritual traditions far removed from the isolation of the coast. Passages were sometimes read aloud to families, or quietly absorbed in solitude. The language, cadence, and familiarity of these texts offered comfort and a measure of companionship, grounding the keeper in rhythms of contemplation as the long day wore on. The act of reading became both ritual and refuge, a pause within the ceaseless labor of tending lamps, grounds, and living quarters. Occasionally, worn novels or other secular texts were included in the collection. These were rare, often borrowed from supply ships or brought from the mainland by family members. The novels were read slowly, carefully, with attention to both plot and the rhythm of words. They provided brief escapes, a means of mental wandering to distant towns, imagined landscapes, and human interactions otherwise absent from the station. Even these stories, however, were absorbed at a deliberate pace, their reading interwoven with the ongoing cycles of maintenance and preparation. Books were seldom left open or unattended, for in the small salt-sprayed quarters, paper was vulnerable to damp, wind, and accidental damage. The physical space of the library was modest. Shelves, if present, were often built into corners of rooms or against walls, holding volumes upright and orderly. More frequently, books were stacked carefully on tables or tucked into cupboards, kept away from moisture or sand. The smell of old paper, ink, and faint salt filled the small area, a sensory reminder of both distance and proximity, the world beyond the station present in the form of pages, yet contained safely within the quiet of home. Time spent in the library was measured and deliberate. Afternoons or early evenings were often devoted to reading or consulting charts, as the chores of the day were completed and preparations for night had begun. The keeper might cross-reference notes in the logbook with information in a chart, or read a passage aloud to a family member while the last light of day fell across floors and walls. Even these moments were embedded within the broader rhythm of duty. While eyes absorbed letters, numbers, or stories, the mind remained attuned to the sea, the lamp, and the steady requirements of vigilance. The library also served as a quiet retreat from both solitude and supervision. In an environment where almost every act was dictated by labor or regulation, books provided a rare domain of autonomy. A keeper could sit for long periods, absorbed in thought, moving fingers along margins, tracing coastlines with care, or silently reflecting on a passage. The act of reading, though calm and still, was itself a form of continuity, reinforcing a sense of personal agency within the structured confines of the station. Ultimately, the keeper's library was both practical and spiritual, instructive and reflective. It housed the tools for navigation, the records of daily diligence, and the words that nourished mind and spirit. In a place dominated by routine, wind, and waves, it was a small, persistent locus of engagement with thought, memory, and imagination. Each book, chart, or journal carried weight, connecting the keeper to both the wider world and to the slow unfolding of life within the lighthouse itself. In this way, the library was another layer of the station's quiet structure, a space where observation, record-keeping, reflection, and imagination converged. The keeper moved among its contents with the same deliberate care applied to lamps, grounds, and domestic tasks, maintaining continuity, patience, and awareness. The books remained, quietly marking the hours, as the light above the waves waited to shine once more. The isolation of a lighthouse was not merely physical. It was a subtle, pervasive condition that shaped the psychological landscape of the keeper and his household. Situated on rocky promontories, distant islands, or stretches of exposed coastline, the station was removed from the rhythms of towns, villages, and neighboring households. The nearest neighbors might be miles away, and visits rare, constrained by weather, tides, and the careful scheduling of supply ships. In this space, the keeper existed almost entirely within the twin presences of wind and sea, accompanied by the quiet hum of machinery, the occasional cry of gulls, and the faint, persistent smell of oil and salt. Solitude at a lighthouse was a slow companion. Days and nights unfolded in repetitive cycles, marked by maintenance, meals, observation, and preparation for the lamp. The hours of daylight were often filled with repetitive labor, yet they also allowed for moments of quiet reflection. The mind, unoccupied by neighbors or the noise of human activity, turned inward, observing not only the external environment, but the subtle workings of time, perception, and thought. The keeper became attuned to the patterns of clouds, the rhythm of tides, and the behavior of birds, finding a steady, if impersonal, companionship in these natural constants. The wind, ever present, shaped the experience of solitude. Its force against the tower, windows, and fences was unrelenting, shifting in intensity without notice, sometimes violent, sometimes barely perceptible. It carried salt, sand, and moisture, marking surfaces and garments, and serving as a constant, tactile reminder of the sea's presence. At times it produced a low, continuous whistle through crevices and rigging, a sound both mournful and hypnotic. The keeper, accustomed to this auditory landscape, absorbed it almost without thought. Yet, it shaped a pervasive sense of presence, a continuous companion to the otherwise empty hours. The sea, for its part, offered both constancy and uncertainty. Its surface reflected the light, colors, and moods of the sky, from the calm shimmer of morning to the storm-darkened waves of evening. Its rhythms were cyclical, yet unpredictable, producing tides, swells, and currents that demanded observation and respect. The distant passage of ships provided intermittent markers of human activity, yet these were rare and fleeting. Most days the sea was an expansive emptiness, an ever-present horizon against which the small, fragile tower stood. The keeper's consciousness expanded to encompass this vast, indifferent space, learning to tolerate its vastness as a quiet element of daily existence. The absence of social life was both practical and profound. Keepers often lived with a spouse or a small family, yet even these relationships operated within the constraints of isolation and labor. Visitors were scarce, and the exchange of news, ideas, or companionship occurred mostly through letters or infrequent supply runs. Social interaction, when it occurred, was deliberate, paced, and framed by the duties of the station. The silence between such interactions was long, and the keeper learned to inhabit it as a landscape in its own right, finding continuity and stability within the unbroken stretches of solitude. Psychologically, this solitude required adjustment. Time could feel elastic, minutes expanding into hours, days stretching into weeks. The repetitive nature of chores and observation provided structure, yet the absence of the usual human feedback loops demanded internal discipline. Keepers developed habits of mindfulness, ritualized action, and careful observation to anchor themselves. The constant quiet attention to lamps, lenses, logs, and grounds became not only practical labor, but a form of mental stabilization, allowing the mind to focus on measurable tasks rather than the vagaries of isolation. Family life, when present, offered intermittent relief. Shared meals, reading, or the maintenance of the household provided companionship. Yet these moments were embedded within the larger solitude of the station. Children might play or assist with tasks, but the scale of social interaction remained modest, confined to the family unit. Friends, neighbors, or casual social gatherings were almost entirely absent. Letters served as rare conduits of connection to the broader human world, carrying news, encouragement, and reminders of a life beyond the tower. Nature itself became a companion. The rhythmic crash of waves, the cry of seabirds, and the movements of tides and clouds provided a patterned backdrop against which human consciousness could situate itself. These elements were predictable yet alive, offering both constancy and subtle variation. Keepers attuned themselves to these patterns, deriving both practical knowledge and quiet reassurance from their observation. In essence, the natural environment became both task and companion, its rhythms shaping the inner life of the isolated station. Solitude was also a teacher of endurance. The unbroken presence of wind, sea, and isolation required patience, attentiveness, and resilience. Emotional fluctuations from mild anxiety to quiet melancholy were common, and the keeper learned to regulate them through adherence to routine, structured observation, and deliberate engagement with work. Even in moments of stress or storm, the familiar rhythms of labor, polishing, cleaning, recording, observing, offered continuity and a sense of mastery over the station. Even as the external world remained vast, unpredictable, and largely indifferent. Ultimately, the keeper's solitude was a condition neither wholly positive nor negative, but deeply formative. It instilled patience, self-reliance, and a contemplative awareness of time and environment. Life in this quiet expanse was governed by cycles of duty, observation, and preparation, and the mind adapted to inhabit this rhythm fully. Each wave that struck the rocks, each gust of wind, each passing cloud became both companion and context, situating the keeper within a world defined by continuity, vigilance, and unending, slow attentiveness. In this way, the psychological landscape of the lighthouse was as carefully maintained as its brass, its grounds, and its lamp. Solitude was both environment and discipline, shaping thought, perception, and daily life. The keeper endured, not through social distraction or variety, but through slow, deliberate engagement with the tasks, rhythms and quiet constancies of the station. Life at the lighthouse, in its solitude, became a meditation in motion, continuous, measured and unbroken, framed by wind, sea and the unceasing cycle of light and darkness. As daylight gradually waned and the long shadowed hours of evening approached, the keeper prepared for the station's most deliberate meal of the day, the evening repast. This meal, unlike the hastier breakfast or midday fare, was slow, measured and shaped by both practicality and the rhythm of the surrounding environment. It marked the transition from the labor of day to the vigilant anticipation of night, providing sustenance for both body and mind before the return to the lamp's demanding oversight. Evenings were often quiet, the soft light of sunset spilling through the small windows of the keeper's quarters, glancing off polished brass, oil-stained tables, and worn wooden floors. The air carried faint traces of salt, wind and oil, mingling with the aromas of simple cooking. Meals were modest, salted or preserved meats, dried beans or peas, hard bread softened by soaking or cooking, and the occasional vegetables from the garden tended earlier in the day. The simplicity of ingredients reflected both the limitations imposed by isolation and the practical demands of storage, preparation, and preservation over long periods. Preparation was methodical. Meat was simmered or roasted in small quantities, carefully tended to avoid waste. Grains or legumes were measured and boiled. Vegetables, if present, were washed, trimmed and cut with deliberate attention. Cooking vessels, stoves and hearths were maintained with the same precision as lamps and brass fixtures. Every action was slow, purposeful, and rhythmical. Water poured, vegetables stirred, bread cut, all executed in a quiet, meditative cadence that mirrored the unhurried movement of the sea outside. Rarely the evening meal included fresh provisions. Fish caught in nearby waters or vegetables from the station garden provided small bursts of variety amidst the otherwise preserved fare. These items were handled with care, washed, cooked, and shared slowly, their flavors both nourishment and subtle delight. Even these occasional luxuries were woven into the ritual of preparation, consumed with awareness and appreciation, rather than haste or indulgence. Meals were eaten with a sense of necessity intertwined with quiet attentiveness, each bite a small acknowledgement of survival, sustenance and routine. Family members, if present, participated fully in the evening meal. The act of eating together, though subdued, provided companionship within the larger solitude of the station. Conversation was measured, often reflective, concerning the day's events, observations of the sea, or the simple exchange of thoughts about chores, weather, or correspondence. Children, if present, learned early the rhythm of the meal and the disciplined pace at which it was undertaken. Silence, punctuated only by utensils and occasional voices, became part of the ritual, reinforcing the atmosphere of deliberate calm that defined life at the lighthouse. Preservation was an ongoing concern. Salted meats, dried grains, and stored vegetables were carefully rationed, ensuring supplies would last until the next delivery. The keeper monitored portions and preparation methods, mindful of spoilage or waste, conscious that the station's limited resources demanded prudence. This attention to detail, even in the act of eating, reflected the overarching rhythm of the station. Every movement measured, every action purposeful, each sustaining both the immediate need and the ongoing continuity of life. The evening meal also provided a pause, a space for reflection on the day's labors. The keeper's hands, accustomed to polishing brass, trimming wicks and maintaining grounds, rested briefly. The mind, accustomed to constant observation of weather, tides and vessels, found moments of quiet. This pause allowed awareness to settle, a slow transition from the activity of day to the concentrated vigilance of night. The fading light outside mirrored the gradual lowering of energy, signaling that preparation for the lamp and the coming hours of darkness would soon become paramount. Even in this quiet pause, attention remained subtly divided. The lamp's readiness required ongoing thought, oil reservoirs checked, wicks prepared, lenses polished and inspected. The keeper ate slowly, methodically, fully conscious of the impending return to duty. The meal was both nourishment and ritual, a means of stabilizing the body and mind for the long hours ahead. Every motion, pouring water, stirring a pot, cutting bread, was part of a continuum in which sustenance, labor, and observation merged. By the conclusion of the evening meal, The station assumed its familiar rhythm once again, tables cleared, stoves extinguished, utensils washed, and provisions returned to storage. The quiet intensity of preparation for the night began in earnest. Families retreated to tasks, reading or minor repairs, while the keeper turned fully toward the lantern and lens above. The transition from day to night was measured, deliberate, and unhurried, each stage flowing into the next, with an awareness of continuity, responsibility, and the enduring cycle of life at the lighthouse. In this way, the evening meal was more than simple sustenance. It was a ritual, a slow acknowledgement of effort expended and effort yet to come, a deliberate interlude in the measured life of the station. The act of eating, careful and unhurried, became a reflection of the overall ethos: patience, persistence and attention, carried steadily through hours, days and seasons in quiet communion with wind, sea and light. As the final traces of daylight faded, the keeper turned to the most solemn and ritualized task of the day, lighting the lamp. This was the culmination of hours of preparation, observation and labor, and it demanded the same meticulous attention that had governed every preceding task. The moment was both quiet and profound, marking the transition from day to night, the period of human action to the vigil of light against darkness, and the keeper's presence to the service of all vessels at sea. The ascent began with the spiral stairs of the tower, worn smooth by countless footsteps yet ever demanding care. Each tread, polished and slightly slick from the moisture of sea air, required deliberate attention. The keeper's movements were measured, slow, and precise, guided by a deep awareness of responsibility. Every step upward was a reminder of the station's isolation and the unbroken duty to those navigating the waters beyond the rocks. The staircase, narrow and enclosed, amplified the quiet of the station, emphasizing the contemplative nature of the task ahead. Upon reaching the lantern room, the keeper undertook the preparation of the lamp itself. The wick was trimmed with precision, its length carefully measured to ensure an even, steady flame. Oil reservoirs were examined and filled, checked for leaks or impurities, and wiped clean to remove residue from previous burnings. The brass and glass of the lamp were polished to remove even the faintest smudge, ensuring that the light would pass unimpeded, its beam traveling as far and as clearly as the physics of lens and flame would allow. Every motion was deliberate, reflective of both skill and reverence for the role the lamp played in safeguarding life. Ignition was approached with the same careful mindfulness. A match, flint or wick igniter was applied, and the lamp began to glow. The keeper observed the flame as it took hold, ensuring that it was steady, that the reservoir fed it correctly, and that the light was properly centered within the Fresnel lens. The rotation, if present, was set in motion, the mechanism turning the lens slowly to project its beam across the water. The movement was quiet, almost meditative, the soft whir of gears accompanied by the faint hiss of oil burning, and the low hum of the tower settling into the night. From this vantage point, the keeper could observe the full sweep of the illuminated horizon. The light, reflected and magnified by the prism, created a luminous arc that traced the curvature of the sea, reaching distant vessels, guiding them safely past hidden rocks, shoals, and shallows. The act of lighting the lamp was both mechanical and spiritual, a silent acknowledgement of responsibility, endurance, and the unbroken human presence at the edge of the natural world. In this moment, the station seemed to breathe, the walls absorbing shadows, the tower holding its solitary vigil against the darkness beyond. Even the smallest details were attended to. Glass panes were examined for fog or condensation, the flame checked for flicker or unevenness, and oil levels monitored to ensure continuous burning throughout the night. Every adjustment was slow, deliberate, and repeated as necessary, reinforcing the principle that vigilance at the lighthouse was measured not in grand gestures, but in careful, continuous attention. The keeper's hands, trained through years of repetition, moved with precision born of habit, patience, and intimate knowledge of both the equipment and the environment. Lighting the lamp was also a sensory experience, shaped by the quiet of the tower and the surrounding landscape. The sound of wind against the structure, the distant crash of waves, and the occasional cry of a gull formed a background to the soft, steady glow of the lamp. Light and darkness were rendered tangible, the beam cutting through shadows, reflecting off surfaces, and traveling outward into a world otherwise indifferent to human presence. The keeper stood within this luminous space, aware of isolation, yet conscious that the labor performed provided safety, guidance, and continuity for those navigating the perilous seas. The ritual of lighting the lamp was repeated nightly, a slow and unbroken cadence that mirrored the cycles of day and tide. Even after ignition, the keeper remained observant, checking the mechanism, ensuring the flame's steadiness, and monitoring for changes in weather or conditions that might affect its effectiveness. This vigilance continued silently, deliberately, until the first light of dawn would eventually signal the completion of one cycle and the gradual return to day labor. In this way, lighting the lamp was both action and meditation. It was the apex of the day's preparation, the moment where skill, discipline, and awareness coalesced into a tangible service to mariners. The tower became a quiet beacon, not only for ships but for the rhythms of human labor and patience, a solitary sentinel in which every measured gesture, every careful adjustment, and every watchful glance contributed to an enduring, slow, and essential work. With the lamp fully ignited, and the horizon cast in its steady luminous sweep, the keeper entered the longest and quietest chapter of the day, the vigil. Night at a lighthouse was a period defined by patience, observation, and meticulous attention, a time when the isolation of the station deepened and the demands of responsibility intensified. The keeper remained alert to subtle shifts in light, wind, and tide, aware that countless lives at sea depended upon the steadfastness of both flame and observer. The vigil was marked first by the continuous care of the lamp. Oil levels were monitored with deliberate precision, ensuring that the flame would neither sputter nor falter. The wick was inspected periodically, trimmed and adjusted to maintain an even glow, and the lens cleaned as necessary to preserve clarity. These tasks, repeated at measured intervals, required both skill and focus, yet they were carried out without haste or drama. Each adjustment, each observation, was a quiet affirmation of responsibility, a deliberate act woven into the uninterrupted rhythm of night. Logs were maintained throughout the hours, a continuous record of weather, sea conditions, passing vessels, and the behavior of the lamp itself. Observations were precise. Wind direction, barometric pressure, cloud formations, and temperature were noted carefully, alongside details of the light's rotation and intensity. These entries, though factual and detached, provided structure to the long night, a framework that tethered the mind to measurable phenomena while maintaining the station's operational readiness. Writing was slow, deliberate, each stroke of ink on paper, both a record and a ritual. The horizon itself demanded constant attention. Ships, if visible in the dim glow, were noted for course, size, and proximity, their navigation aided by the beam cutting through darkness. The sea could shift subtly in minutes, tides rising, waves forming patterns, and currents altering with imperceptible gradations. The keeper's eyes, trained by repetition and experience, scanned the waters patiently, noting movement, light reflections, and cloud formations that might signal changes in weather. Vigilance was silent yet comprehensive, a continuous engagement with both natural and human activity. Isolation was heightened in these hours, the wind's whispers through the tower, the distant crash of waves, and the occasional cry of nocturnal seabirds composed the night's soundscape. The keeper, often alone in the lantern room, moved slowly, performing duties with deliberate rhythm. Each task, from polishing brass to adjusting the wick, was an anchor in time, a small certainty in the expansive emptiness of darkness. The mental landscape of the vigil demanded patience, the mind occupied by rhythm, observation, and measured labor, while remaining aware of potential emergencies. Periods of storm or fog intensified the vigilance. Gusts of wind rattled windows and shook doors, while waves surged against rocks, testing the station's structure. In fog, the keeper relied upon sound and careful observation, listening for ship horns, bellbuoys, or distant engines, ready to adjust signals or take note in logs. Even in the most challenging conditions, the work remained deliberate and unhurried. The keeper's training, combined with routine and calm endurance, allowed navigation of these challenges without panic, maintaining the continuity of light, observation, and record keeping. The night's solitude was profound. Hours unfolded slowly, marked by the steady sweep of the lamp, and the passage of time measured in changes to the wind, sea, and sky. The keeper's awareness alternated between micro-observation, flame intensity, oil levels, lens clarity, and macro-observation, the vast expanse of darkened water, the distant horizon, and the passage of night itself. Sleep, if taken at all, was brief and segmented, always balanced against the continuous requirements of vigilance. Meals and small sustenance were consumed with care, often simple, portable fare kept nearby to avoid leaving the lamp unattended. Hydration, occasional bread or preserved meat, and careful attention to bodily needs were integrated into the vigil with the same deliberate rhythm applied to all other tasks. These small acts reinforced continuity. They provided the physical stamina necessary to sustain the uninterrupted attention required, while maintaining the quiet, meditative pace that defined lighthouse life. By dawn, the vigil transitioned slowly toward conclusion. The first pale light on the horizon was noted in logs, the oil reservoirs checked one final time before morning, the lens inspected in anticipation of the changeover from night to day. The keeper remained alert, attentive, yet conscious of the gradual shift in responsibility. The night's labor, though long and solitary, was completed in continuity, each task executed with deliberation and care, ensuring the lamp's uninterrupted guidance and the safety of those at sea. In this way, the keeper's vigil was both practical and contemplative. It was a period of responsibility sustained in silence and solitude, a slow, continuous engagement with light, wind, and water. Each hour of observation, logging, and lamp maintenance reinforced the rhythms of lighthouse life, shaping both the external world of maritime safety and the internal discipline of endurance, patience, and attentiveness. Even in the slow, steady rhythm of lighthouse life, there were nights and days when the usual monotony was pierced by the quiet intensity of storms. These events, though rare, demanded heightened vigilance and skill, transforming the familiar routines of the station into prolonged exercises of endurance and observation. Rain, wind, and the unrelenting surge of waves made every task more difficult, every measurement more critical, and every glance at the horizon laden with the possibility of peril. Storms were not sudden spectacles but gradual, accumulative shifts. The sky would darken, clouds thickening with subtle urgency, colors deepening into slate and indigo, and the wind beginning its first whispered hints of strength. The keeper, attuned to these early signs, adjusted preparations, oil reservoirs checked once more, wicks trimmed with added care, and lamps examined to ensure resilience against moisture or gusts. Even before the storm's arrival, the station seemed to vibrate with expectation, the wind tugging at the tower, the sea beginning its restless swell, each sound a quiet signal of the challenges yet to come. When the storm struck, it enveloped the station in continuous tactile intensity. Rain beat against windows, saturating stone and mortar. The wind whistled through every crevice and rotated rigging with a low mechanical moan. Waves surged against rocks and piers, sending spray high into the air. The lighthouse became a shelter against the tumult, its walls vibrating in sympathy with the forces outside. Within, the keeper maintained deliberate focus, tending the lamp, polishing lenses, and logging weather conditions in painstaking detail. Every motion was deliberate, each gesture a quiet assertion of control over an environment otherwise determined by unpredictable natural forces. Shipwrecks, when they occurred, added an additional layer of responsibility and solemnity. In the dark sweep of storm-tossed waters, vessels might approach dangerously close to shoals or rocks, their lights flickering in alignment with the chaos of waves. From the lantern room, the keeper observed their struggle, the tilting hulls, the muted cries of unseen sailors, and the desperate efforts to navigate safely. The lighthouse, though static and immobile, became the pivot of guidance and hope, its beams slicing through the darkness to indicate safe passage, to warn of hazards, or tragically, to bear witness to misfortune. These moments were imbued with quiet tension. The keeper was both observer and intermediary, silently documenting the conditions while offering indirect aid through the constancy of the light. Notes were meticulously entered into the logbook, time, weather, vessel type, position, and any signs of distress. These records, precise and methodical, later served as official accounts of the station's performance, yet in the moment they were also a form of mental anchoring, a structured practice that allowed the keeper to maintain composure amidst chaos. The psychological impact of storms and shipwrecks was subtle but persistent. The long hours of observation, combined with isolation and the overwhelming scale of natural forces, demanded resilience and calm. There was no opportunity for dramatics. Survival, both of the station and of those at sea, required methodical action and attention to detail. Every adjustment to the lamp, every check of oil or wick, every note in the log reinforced a sense of continuity, providing a stabilizing framework within the turbulence of weather and danger. Storms could last hours or even days, creating extended periods of heightened focus. Meals were minimal and functional, sleep brief and fitful, and every moment of attention directed toward both the lamp and the horizon. The tower, normally a quiet sentinel, became a site of relentless observation, its keeper engaged in unending cycles of measurement, maintenance, and reflection. Outside, the sea's rhythm was amplified, waves crashing in relentless repetition, wind howling, and the darkness deepened by storm clouds. Yet inside, every action was deliberate, a testament to endurance, training, and the quiet perseverance required by the station's duties. In the aftermath of storms or shipwrecks, the station returned gradually to its slower rhythms. Broken fences, damaged roofs, and scattered equipment were repaired, logs were reviewed and consolidated. Reflections on the night's events became part of the ongoing record of service. Even when lives were lost at sea, the keeper's role remained measured and methodical, preserving continuity, maintaining equipment, and observing for the next challenge. The weight of witnessing such events, though heavy, was integrated into the broader experience of lighthouse life, a quiet, enduring aspect of service and vigilance. Storms and shipwrecks, therefore, existed not as climactic narratives, but as extensions of the steady contemplative labor of the lighthouse. They emphasized the isolation, responsibility, and patience demanded of the keeper, reinforcing the subtle rhythms of observation, care, and endurance. Each storm was endured with meticulous attention, each shipwreck documented without embellishment, and each night, no matter how violent, became another quiet testament to the unbroken work of those who maintained light against darkness. In many lighthouses, particularly those situated on larger islands or along heavily trafficked coasts, the keeper was not entirely alone in the tasks of maintaining the light, observing the weather, and ensuring maritime safety. Headkeepers were often assigned one or more assistants, whose presence subtly shifted both the pace of labor and the psychological landscape of the station. Even family members, when present, might take part in measured, carefully delineated responsibilities. The rotation of duties across personnel was a deliberate system, designed to preserve continuity, share the burdens of the long night, and ensure that the lamp never faltered in its steady sweep across darkened waters. Assistants were trained in the precise, slow methods required for proper lighthouse operation. They learned the mechanics of lamps, the handling of oil and wicks, the meticulous cleaning of brass and lenses, and the proper recording of observations in the logbooks. Their labor, while secondary to that of the headkeeper, was structured with the same attention to detail and the same deliberate pace that defined every action in the station. Each assistant's responsibilities were clearly defined, yet flexible enough to respond to changes in weather, equipment, or workload. Through this methodical allocation, the work of the station became a collaborative rhythm, even in the broader context of isolation and distance from the mainland. The division of labor often followed predictable cycles. During the night, one keeper might attend the lamp, performing the precise trimming, filling, and monitoring of the flame, while another maintained the lens and polished the brass fittings. Periodically, duties were rotated, allowing each person a brief period of rest or attention to minor domestic chores. This rotation was executed deliberately, without rush or distraction, ensuring that continuity of the light and meticulous observation were never compromised. It also introduced a subtle variation into the night, a quiet rhythm that punctuated the otherwise steady, unbroken vigil. Family members sometimes participated in these rotations, particularly when assistants were unavailable. Older children might carry logs between rooms, refill oil containers, or perform simple maintenance tasks, while spouses assisted with the preparation of meals or the management of quarters. Each action was small, deliberate, and integrated into the overarching system of care and observation. The station became a microcosm of interdependent labor, each member aware of their responsibilities, performing them slowly, with consciousness of the greater continuity they maintained together. The presence of assistants also affected the psychological experience of solitude. While the keeper remained responsible for critical tasks, shared labor mitigated the intensity of isolation, providing intermittent social interaction and shared observation. Conversations, though subdued and purposeful, punctuated the long hours with subtle markers of human connection, reinforcing attention and providing reassurance. Even in the darkest, stormiest nights, the rotation of duties and the presence of trained colleagues offered a quiet sense of mutual reliance, an unspoken acknowledgement that the responsibilities of vigilance were shared rather than borne entirely alone. These rotations extended beyond mere convenience. They were essential to the operational success of the station. The demands of night, especially in storm or fog, could exhaust a single individual if sustained without relief. Careful scheduling and the precise division of tasks ensured that fatigue did not compromise observation or lamp maintenance. Each rotation was executed with attention to the pace of work, the strength and stamina of personnel, and the uninterrupted requirement of the light. This deliberate management of human effort reflected both practicality and the unspoken rhythm of lighthouse life, where every hour mattered, yet every movement was measured. Log keeping, a central task during the night, also benefited from rotation. One keeper might record observations continuously for a period, while another confirmed measurements, adjusted equipment, or scanned the horizon. The alternation reinforced accuracy, allowed for brief mental respite, and preserved the methodical flow of duties without interruption. The shared labor, though quiet and procedural, became a subtle choreography, where each member's actions complemented the others, creating a continuous interwoven vigilance. The shared labor, night's rotation of duties, when combined with the careful oversight of the head keeper, created a rhythm both practical and meditative. Every movement, trimming the wick, refilling oil, cleaning the lens, noting the weather, was performed deliberately, with awareness of both individual responsibility and the collective continuity of the station. This shared rotating labor reinforced patience, endurance, and attentiveness, sustaining not only the light itself but the cohesion of those who maintained it. Even when assistants or family were absent, the memory and practice of rotation shaped the keeper's approach. Duties were broken into measurable periods, tasks executed in sequence, and attention maintained with disciplined regularity. The system of rotation, whether enacted physically with multiple people or mentally with a single keeper, ensured that the station's labor remained slow, deliberate, and continuous. In essence, assistants and family members functioned as extensions of the keeper's vigilance. Their participation, structured yet unobtrusive, allowed the light to remain steady, the log accurate, and the rhythm of the night uninterrupted. This quiet collaboration, embedded in the broader solitude of the station, exemplified the balance of human endurance, shared responsibility, and meticulous care that defined life in a 19th-century lighthouse. Life at a 19th-century lighthouse was measured not only by the cycles of day and night, but also by the slow, inexorable passage of the seasons. Each season brought its own character, its own rhythm, and its own demands upon the keeper, subtly shaping both labor and consciousness. While the daily duties of maintaining the lamp, polishing lenses, and tending the grounds remained constant, the environmental context shifted gradually, influencing the pace, intensity, and nature of each day's work. Spring arrived first with a delicate persistence. Mists rolled over the water in long, silent blankets, obscuring the horizon in soft grey layers that demanded constant vigilance. Fog became a principal companion, its presence altering the way the keeper approached observation. Horns and bellbuoys gained sudden importance. The beam of light, though steady, became less visible, its utility heightened by the silent shifting veil of moisture. Chores adapted to these conditions. Lanterns might require more frequent inspection, lenses wiped to remove condensation, and logs annotated with precise descriptions of visibility and tide patterns. Spring also brought winds that shifted unpredictably, requiring careful attention to anchor points, fences, and boats. The keeper learned to read these changes as both labor and meditation, noting subtle variations in cloud shape, wind direction, and wave behavior over time. Summer, when it arrived, altered the station in its own gradual manner. The days lengthened, offering extended periods of sunlight, warmth, and a slightly slower pace for certain tasks. Maintenance of the grounds and structures could be performed with ease. Paint dried faster, oil containers could be stored in open air, and minor repairs were less impeded by cold or damp. Yet summer also brought its own subtleties. Heat could cause oils to expand or become more viscous. Bright sun could intensify glare on polished brass and glass, and the longer days required careful attention to the transition into night, so that the lamp would remain ready. Seabirds nested more frequently near the tower, their calls and movements woven into the rhythms of observation, while passing ships increased in number, signaling both trade and potential hazards. Autumn approached with a slow, inexorable change. Storms became more frequent, clouds heavier, and winds stronger, heralding both isolation and the increased need for preparedness. The keeper's work shifted subtly. Extra attention was given to securing equipment, reinforcing fences, and checking the integrity of roofs and windows. The lamp's maintenance became more crucial, as visibility decreased under overcast skies and early darkness settled over the coast. Autumn was a period of heightened vigilance, yet its pace remained deliberate. The keeper learned to adjust the rhythm of chores, balancing domestic maintenance, lamp preparation, and observation against the extended demands imposed by inclement weather. Winter imposed the most profound transformations upon the station. Ice formed on rocks, piers, and stairways. Frost and snow coated the grounds, slowing movement and intensifying labor. The lamp's oil required careful monitoring, as cold could affect its flow and combustion. Wicks had to be kept dry, and lenses cleared of frost. Travel to and from the station became limited or impossible, making the arrival of supply ships infrequent and increasing the need for careful rationing. Even domestic life shifted. Stoves burned steadily for warmth, preserved foods became more heavily relied upon, and the keeper's physical movements were constrained by layers of clothing and the ever-present threat of slips or falls. Yet in this stark environment, the rhythm of life became particularly meditative. Each task, each step, each observation was performed with slow, deliberate attention, its importance magnified by the harshness of conditions. Throughout all seasons, the keeper's awareness of time was deeply entwined with environmental cues. Sunlight, cloud cover, fog, storm intensity, tides, and ice all dictated labor, influenced pacing, and shaped mental rhythms. The repetition of duties, lighting the lamp, tending logs, maintaining grounds, remained constant, yet each season's nuances required adaptation, patience, and an intimate understanding of nature's gradual changes. In this way, the passage of time was both objective and experiential, measured not only by clocks or log entries, but by the subtle, observable transformations of sea, sky, and land. The station itself became a living record of seasonal rhythms. Polished brass dulled slightly under foggy spring days, grounds became snowbound in winter, fences warped under summer sun, and structures bore the cumulative effects of wind and salt year-round. These changes demanded constant observation, gentle maintenance, and patient adjustment, integrating both labor and mindfulness into the keeper's daily life. Every season imposed its own tempo, and the keeper, through careful attention and enduring presence, synchronized with it, finding continuity and stability within the slow, unbroken cycles of nature. In essence, the slow passage of seasons shaped the lighthouse and its inhabitants in profound ways. Each season imposed its own challenges, subtly transforming labor, observation, and domestic life. Yet within these shifts, there was continuity, patience, and rhythm. The lamp burned nightly, the logbooks recorded events, and the keeper remained ever vigilant, attentive to both environmental nuances and the slow unfolding of time. Life at the lighthouse, mediated by seasonal change, became a meditation in endurance, observation, and the quiet persistence of duty. As years passed, and the relentless cycles of day, night, and season continued, the lighthouse keeper approached a slower, quieter chapter of life, the end of service, retirement, reassignment, or replacement by emerging technologies, such as automated lamps, electric illumination, and mechanized rotation systems, marked the conclusion of a deeply immersive, disciplined and solitary career. The keeper, having spent countless hours observing the wind, waves and horizon, maintaining lamps and lenses, and recording meticulous logs, now faced the gradual withdrawal from a world defined by routine, responsibility, and the slow, meditative rhythm of maritime vigilance. The transition was often subtle. A younger keeper might be appointed to assist or gradually take over duties, providing continuity of service while the veteran observed, instructed, and reflected. These final months or years were filled with the quiet satisfaction of imparting accumulated knowledge, habits and rhythms to those who would continue the work. Every gesture, from trimming a wick to logging weather patterns, was not only an exercise in precision, but also a lesson in patience, endurance and responsibility, a transmission of the very culture of lighthouse keeping. Reflection became a companion to the retiring keeper. Memories accumulated over decades, fog-laden mornings, storms that roared for hours, the precise sweep of a beam across treacherous waters, and the small but deliberate rhythms of polishing brass, tending the grounds, or preparing meals. Each action, once repetitive, now resonated with significance, a record of skill applied, labor completed, and lives indirectly safeguarded. The keeper's mind traced these years slowly, like the rotation of the lantern, noting the subtle interplay of human effort, isolation, and the enduring constancy of natural forces. Technological change gradually transformed the lighthouse itself. Fresnel lenses were replaced with electric lights, automated systems reduced the necessity for constant human presence, and distant monitoring became possible. These innovations, while efficient, marked a quiet shift. The personal, tactile and meditative work of a human keeper was no longer required in the same way. Yet the legacy of keepers persisted, embedded in logs, station records, structural maintenance, and most importantly, the memory of maritime culture. The routines honed over decades, meticulous lamp care, disciplined observation, and precise record keeping, remained integral to the safety and guidance of vessels long after human presence was minimized. The keeper's legacy was not only operational, but cultural. Tales of life at the lighthouse, memoirs and reports contributed to maritime history, shaping how later generations understood coastal labor, isolation, and vigilance. The repetitive, slow-paced work, often unnoticed by the broader public, became emblematic of dedication and endurance, a quiet testament to the human capacity for meticulous attention and steadfast responsibility. Through these records, the rhythm of lighthouse life, its isolation, its cycles, its constant observation, persisted in memory, study, and the cultural imagination. Even after retirement, the keeper remained connected to the rhythms of the sea and the structures that had defined so much of life. Visits to the lighthouse, the recounting of past storms, and the observation of automated lights in place of human labor provided opportunities for reflection and continuity. These encounters, while less laborious, allowed the keeper to witness the evolution of technology, the enduring relevance of past labor, and the quiet passage of time. In each glance at the steady beam cutting through darkness, the keeper recognized both continuity and change, human diligence preserved, even as necessity for presence diminished. The broader legacy extended to families and communities. Children, trained in small tasks, or neighbors who interacted periodically with the keeper, carried fragments of the station's disciplined routine and values. The lighthouse, though solitary and remote, served as a conduit of cultural memory, a place where observation, care, patience, and quiet endurance were learned, practiced, and transmitted. Each stone tower, polished brass, and recorded logbook became a vessel of memory, preserving the ethos of those who had lived and worked within its walls. Ultimately, the keeper's legacy was an enduring presence of care and vigilance, a testament to human patience in the face of vast, indifferent nature. While technology and automation altered the physical work of lighthouses, the intangible routines, skills, and principles of keepers persisted. Maritime safety, historical memory, and cultural understanding all bore traces of decades of measured labor, deliberate observation, and quiet endurance. The keeper, through routine and reflection, left an imprint not only on the station, but on the broader human understanding of isolation, responsibility, and the slow, careful rhythm of life by the sea. Life at the lighthouse, in its solitary, meticulous and deliberate unfolding, had ended for the individual keeper, but the patterns of labor, observation, and vigilance became part of maritime memory. The daily rhythms, the seasonal adjustments, the storms endured, the lamps tended, and the nights spent in quiet vigilance, all coalesced into a legacy that persisted in logbooks, memoirs, and the cultural imagination, a slow, enduring reflection of human endurance and devotion to duty against the vast, unyielding sea.